Welcome to the past unveiled, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Story 1. The Taika Reforms and the Birth of Bureaucracy. You open your eyes to a Japan that is just beginning to write itself into permanence. It is the year 645 CE, and the summer air in Asuka carries the scent of new beginnings. The rice paddies shimmer in the sun, and somewhere in the capital, a scribe sharpens his brush. He is preparing to copy a document that will change the structure of a nation, the Taika Reforms. Before this moment, Japan is not yet the Japan you know. It is a constellation of clans, each led by chieftains who owe loose allegiance to a Yamato sovereign. Power is familial, diffuse, personal. Tribute flows toward the center not through bureaucratic channels, but through obligation and ceremony. Land belongs not to the state, but to the family. And yet, something has shifted. The old order, sustained by custom, can no longer contain the ambitions of the court. The catalyst comes from across the sea. For decades, Japanese envoys have been visiting the Tang dynasty of China, the most advanced bureaucracy in the world. They have seen how Tang officials manage vast territories through systems of writing, taxation, and administration. They have brought back Confucian texts, Buddhist scriptures, and something more intangible, the idea of order as an institution. When Prince Naka no O and his ally Nakatomi no Kamatari orchestrate the Ishi incident, the assassination of the powerful Soga clan patriarch, it is not only a coup, it is the prelude to an administrative revolution. In the quiet aftermath, Japan begins to adopt the tools of the Chinese state, the written edict, the official seal, the census, and the concept of public land. The Taika reforms are declared with solemn ceremony, and with them comes a new phrase that will echo for centuries. The realm belongs to the emperor. But to make that phrase true requires more than ceremony. It requires bureaucracy and invisible machinery of scribes, counters, messengers, and enforcers. The first task of the new bureaucracy is measurement. If all land belongs to the emperor, it must first be known. The government issues orders to survey the provinces. Messengers are dispatched with scrolls and inkstones. They travel dusty roads to distant rice fields, counting paddies and marking boundaries with wooden stakes. Each parcel is recorded in careful handwriting. The records are returned to the capital and stored in the great halls of the new ministry's Sho and Kaio, modeled after the Tang system. It is here that the true spirit of the Japanese bureaucracy is born, not in battle, but in counting. Farmers who once offered rice as tribute to their clan now pay tax to the emperor. Every household must register its members. Names are written on bamboo slips, an early census known as the koski. Age, gender, and occupation are recorded. The act of writing transforms them from individuals into data, and data into governance. The reforms also bring hierarchy. The new government divides itself into ministries and departments. The Daijōkan, the Great Council of State, sits at the top, presiding over affairs of the realm. Beneath it, 8 ministries handle the machinery of rule: ceremonies, civil administration, war, justice, treasury, the imperial household, and others. Each ministry is subdivided, each role meticulously defined. Rank becomes the language of power. Officials wear caps marked with colors that denote their status: purple for the highest ranks, green for the mid-level, and black for the lowest. The rank system, derived from Confucian ideals, transforms governance into ritual. Even boredom becomes sacred. The daily monotony of reviewing documents, sealing decrees and recording taxes becomes an act of devotion to order. But not everyone welcomes this new order. In the provinces, local chieftains, now renamed kokushi, or provincial governors, struggle to adapt. Their old rights to collect tribute are replaced by bureaucratic oversight. They must send reports to the capital, written in Chinese characters, a script that many barely understand. The reforms demand not only obedience but literacy. In distant villages, peasants are confused by the new officials who arrive with scrolls and seals. They are told that the land now belongs to the emperor, but to them it always has. Their loyalty has always been local to the Lord who protects them, to the ancestors buried in the fields. The new system feels distant, abstract, heavy with unfamiliar words. Yet slowly, over decades, it seeps into their lives. The bureaucracy does not conquer, it accumulates. The Taika reforms are ambitious but imperfect. Implementation falters. Communication between the capital and the provinces is slow. Messages can take weeks, even months. Corruption emerges almost immediately. Officials, underpaid and overworked, take bribes in rice. Some falsify records, others simply ignore decrees that never reach them. And yet, for all its flaws, the system endures. The very act of writing rules, even unenforced ones, changes the psychology of governance. The idea that order can exist on paper becomes self-sustaining. Every generation of officials refines the previous generation's paperwork. Over centuries, the Japanese state becomes less a place of power and more a culture of documentation. In the capital, the emperor's role becomes increasingly ceremonial. Surrounded by officials who quote Confucius and copy Chinese codes, the sovereign presides over rituals rather than decisions. Power flows through ink, not swords. This bureaucratic detachment, this reverence for procedure, becomes one of Japan's enduring legacies. It is, perhaps, the most quietly transformative period in Japanese history. From it will descend the Heian court's obsession with rank and formality, the medieval temple's economic power, and even the modern government's love of documentation. The Taika reforms did not create a perfect state, but they created the habit of governance, a habit that Japan has never entirely lost. If you walk through the ruins of Asuka today, you might find fragments of roof tiles and the foundations of ancient halls. But the real ruins are invisible, buried in archives, preserved in ink, replicated across time. They are the records that began when a few idealists decided that order could be written, measured, and obeyed. And as the first generation of scribes sits by lamplight, copying decrees into scrolls that will travel across provinces, one wonders if they knew what they had created. Not an empire of swords, but of paperwork. A new kind of empire, one that would endure for 1,000 years. You return now to a Japan slowly adjusting to the weight of its own ideals. It is the late 7th century. The fires of the Taika reforms have cooled, but the embers remain glowing in the halls of governance, in the silent, ink-stained rooms of the capital, and in the minds of the ruling elite. In the decades after the initial declarations of reform, Japan takes a more meticulous approach. The ambition is no longer just to imitate China, it is to encode that imitation into law, line by line. The result will become one of the most important legal documents in Japanese history, the Ritsuryo Codes. You may not feel the excitement in this moment. There is no battlefield, no thunderous proclamation, but something foundational is taking place, something that will define governance, daily life, and even thought itself for the next 500 years. This is the age when Japan decides that law can be written into a state, and so it begins. The word Ritsuryo is composed of two Chinese characters, Ritsu, meaning criminal code, and Ryo, meaning administrative code. Together, they represent an all-encompassing system of governance. Where the Taika reforms were bold and broad, the Ritsuryo is meticulous. It is, quite literally, a system of government that lives on scrolls. Between the years 681 and 701 CE, Scholars and officials, often members of the huge aristocracy, work under imperial commission to draft, review, and compile these codes. The result is the Asuka Kiyomihara Code, 689, followed by the more complete Teiho Code, 701, and later the Yoro Code, 718. Each new draft refines the last. The codes are written in classical Chinese, the language of bureaucracy and law, but their effects are entirely Japanese. The codes describe everything, from the way a governor should greet an imperial envoy to the tax obligations of a peasant household, from the weight of a standard rice measure to the punishment for disrupting a ritual. Nothing is too small to regulate. At the heart of the Ritsuryo system lies a concept imported from China but adapted for local realities: land redistribution. Under the Handan Shuju system, the equal field system, all arable land is technically owned by the state. Every 6 years, land is measured and redistributed to male citizens above the age of 6. Each adult male receives a standard allotment, called kyubunden. In return, he owes labor, military service, and taxes. It is elegant in theory. Everyone receives land, everyone owes the state. But in practice, things are more complicated. Surveying land in a mountainous archipelago is not easy. Some villages avoid census takers. Others overreport their populations to receive more land. And over time, the rich begin to find loopholes, accumulating estates, or shun, protected by imperial exemptions. Still, the system functions well enough for a while. The land grants create the illusion of fairness, and more importantly, they tie individuals to the state in a concrete way. Through the field, the government enters every household. The Ritsuryo codes also define society itself literally. All citizens are categorized. At the top are the aristocrats, especially those of the Kazoku noble families, many of whom hold high bureaucratic posts. Below them are the commoners or ryomen, who receive land and bear civic duties. Then come the senmen, the base people, including slaves, criminals, and outcasts. These social distinctions are not fluid. They are encoded in law, reflected in dress, speech, and status. The bureaucracy reflects these ranks. A rigid system of grades, the kani, assigns every official a number, from first rank, the highest, to 8th rank, the lowest, each subdivided into junior and senior positions. Promotion is based on lineage, not merit. The sons of aristocrats enter government service at higher ranks. The sons of commoners rarely enter at all. Still, for those within the system, there is comfort in clarity. Every robe, every scroll, every ritual reinforces a world that is orderly and known. A low-ranking scribe may spend his entire career copying tax registers, but he knows precisely where he stands. Ministries and bureaucracy flourish under the Ritsuryo model. The Daijokan remains at the top, led by the chancellor Daijo Daijin, and supported by ministers of the left and right. Beneath them, the 8 ministries are responsible for every aspect of administration, from ceremonies to justice, from military affairs to finance. Each ministry is subdivided into bureaus, and each bureau is staffed by officials who are trained in Chinese classics, calendrical science, and ritual protocol. Knowledge becomes authority. A typical bureaucrat's day is not glamorous. He arrives before dawn, reads memoranda, stamps documents, oversees minor disputes, and prepares reports. The writing never ends, but the tedium has meaning. It is the machinery that holds the state together. This culture of paperwork is not merely functional, it is spiritual. To record is to confirm. To categorize is to control. In a society where oral tradition once reigned, the act of writing becomes sacred governance. The Ritsuryo state also pays deep attention to ritual and time. The Bureau of Divination Onmyoryo calculates auspicious dates for ceremonies. The calendar itself becomes a tool of power. Festivals are timed to reinforce loyalty to the emperor. The new year is celebrated with courtly precision. The agricultural calendar dictates when taxes are due and when fields are planted. Bureaucrats rely on the Ritsurio calendar to guide policy. Even justice is timed. Certain punishments must be carried out on certain days. Bureaucracy and cosmology become entangled. Officials consult the stars before appointing governors or issuing reforms. This obsession with harmony reflects Confucian ideals. The ruler is to be a moral exemplar. Officials must be virtuous, literate, and disciplined. Society, like nature, must follow its proper order. Of course, the reality is less harmonious. Officials take bribes. Peasants resist taxes. Governors report false census numbers. But the illusion of order is strong enough to endure. It becomes not just a goal, but an identity. Daily life under the Ritsurio system is shaped by these codes in subtle ways. For the average peasant, life is divided between work, ritual, and obligation. He tends his government-allotted land. He reports to village officials who collect taxes usually in rice or cloth. He may be conscripted for labor repairing roads or canals or sent for military training, though in reality, few ever travel far from home. Marriage is regulated. Property inheritance is defined by law. Even naming conventions are influenced by court etiquette. Children are registered in population rolls. If a child dies, a note is made. If a person disappears, a notice is sent to the capital. For aristocrats, life is more refined and more bureaucratic. Their sons study Confucian classics. Their daughters are trained in etiquette and poetry. They attend seasonal rituals, compose reports, and seek favorable appointments. They play a game of rank where advancement means better robes, more rice, and greater prestige. But the game has rules, and the rules are written in scrolls. One of the most impressive aspects of the Ritsurio bureaucracy is its reach. Despite limited technology, the government extends its influence across mountains, islands, and coasts. Messengers Hikyaku travel along the Yamanobe routes, carrying orders sealed with the imperial emblem. Tax collectors ride to distant villages with scrolls and tally sticks. Provincial governors write lengthy reports to the capital, detailing everything from rice production to temple activities. The government even creates storehouses shasun to archive documents, tax goods, and ceremonial items. The most famous, the shasun of Nara, still stands today, a silent testament to a state obsessed with preservation. Japan has become not just a country, but a network connected by paper, rank, and ritual. And yet cracks begin to show. As the 8th century progresses, enforcement becomes difficult. The system is too vast, the officials too few. Local elites begin to bypass the redistribution system. They establish private estates, often protected by imperial patrons. These estates, or shun, do not pay taxes. They are outside the system but tolerated because they are convenient. Peasants begin to flee government land for the protection of shun lords. In return for security, they give up their independence. The equal field system decays. The bureaucracy becomes more ceremonial than practical. Still, the scrolls continue to be copied. The officials continue to wear their robes. The rituals are observed. Bureaucracy has become not just a system of governance, but a habit of the state. Even as its substance declines, its form remains. You are now in the early Heian period. The codes are still read, the ranks still matter, but something has changed. The state, once centralized, is quietly fragmenting. Power is leaking into temples, estates, and aristocratic families. The emperor, now mostly symbolic, remains the center of ritual but not control. And yet, the idea of governance through writing endures. Even when the bureaucracy ceases to function, it is remembered, copied, idealized. The Ritsurio codes become a kind of dream, a model of perfect order, invoked even in disorder. They will echo across the centuries through medieval temple estates, through Edo-era tax registers, and even into the dusty filing cabinets of modern ministries. because once a nation writes its rules into being, it cannot easily forget them. By the time the sun begins to rise over the early Heian period somewhere in the 9th century, the architecture of the Ritsurio state still stands. The ministries are intact. The courtiers still wear caps that indicate their ranks. The inkstones are still wet with mourning work. But there is a hollowness now, a subtle, invisible shift. The bureaucracy still exists, but its power is no longer absolute. The world beneath the paper is changing. In this final section, we examine what happens when a government continues to operate not because it works, but because it must appear to work. When the rituals of administration outlive their practical use. When form overtakes function. This is not the fall of a government. It is the bureaucratic equivalent of sleepwalking, a slow, deliberate drift from reality, still wrapped in the silk robes of legitimacy. The Ritsurio system, by the 9th century, is already struggling to maintain its original promises. The equal field system, the great ideal of land redistribution, has collapsed in practice. Field surveys are neglected. The 6-year reassignment of land becomes theoretical. Officials stop conducting censuses. Villages stop expecting them. Instead, a different model rises, the Shun estate. The Shun is technically illegal. It defies the ideal of state-owned land, but it is practical. Powerful aristocrats, temples, and retired emperors begin to accumulate these private domains. Exempt from taxation, immune to interference, they become states within a state. At first, they coexist with the central government, but slowly, inevitably, they become its replacement. Peasants prefer life under a Shun lord. There is protection, predictability, even generosity. By contrast, the state still demands corvée labor, taxes, military service obligations it can no longer enforce consistently. Given a choice, many farmers quietly migrate to these estates. What results is a bifurcated system. On the surface, the state remains intact. Below it, real power has moved elsewhere. Inside the capital, the court continues to function as if nothing has changed. The emperor receives reports. Edicts are issued. Ministers convene in the early morning chill to read aloud memoranda. The ink on scrolls dries in quiet chambers. Officials record fictitious land distributions. The calendar of obligations remains posted on palace walls. But the reports are now often symbolic. They describe a Japan that no longer exists, a Japan where all land is counted, where every citizen is known, and where every field is measured. It is a country on paper. And yet, there is comfort in this fiction. The rituals of bureaucracy continue not because they work, but because they define the identity of those who perform them. A scribe who copies a tax register knows it will not be enforced, but in copying it, he reenacts a vision of the state, a moment when governance was believed to be total. The scroll becomes a prayer to order. This transformation from governance to ritual bureaucracy is gradual, but unmistakable. One symbol of this shift is the imperial capital itself. In 794, Emperor Kanmu relocates the seat of government to Heian-kyo, modern Kyoto. The new capital is modeled after Chang'an, the Tang Chinese capital, with its rectilinear grid, avenues, and walled compounds. It is a city built not just for habitation, but for symbolism. Within this orderly space, the rituals of governance become more aesthetic than functional. Court ceremonies multiply. Every festival, every appointment, every imperial proclamation follows a prescribed script. Even colors are regulated. Certain shades of purple and red may only be worn by officials of a specific rank. What once was a tool of governance becomes a performance of legitimacy. This performance is critical because, as real control slips away from the court, maintaining the appearance of order becomes paramount. The bureaucracy becomes a stage on which authority is acted, not exercised. Temples and the aristocracy step into this vacuum. Temples, in particular, become major administrative players. Armed with their own land, their own tax systems, and their own records, they operate parallel to the state. Monks maintain archives, settle land disputes, and manage tenant farmers. In some cases, their administrative sophistication rivals that of the ministries. A temple like Tadeji in Nara might manage dozens of estates across provinces, each with ledgers, overseers, and tax quotas. The bureaucracy once centralized in the capital has now gone local, sacred, and decentralized. Similarly, the Fujiwara family, long the most powerful court clan, perfects the art of political manipulation through formality. By marrying daughters into the imperial family, they gain regency power. The emperor rules, but the regent governs. Yet even this governance is mediated through ritual, precedent, and paperwork. This is not a military usurpation. It is a bureaucratic drift power absorbed through titles, appointments, and access to imperial seals. One might ask, why didn't it all fall apart? The answer lies in cultural continuity. Despite the decline in enforcement, the bureaucracy remained a key part of elite identity. To be an official was not just to hold power, but to participate in a lineage of written governance. To wear a cap of rank, to compose Chinese-style poetry, to interpret the codes, these were acts of belonging to a civilization. Even when actual governance faded, the idea of government continued to be copied, memorized, and performed. And among the common people, this structure still had symbolic power. The emperor's name was invoked in rituals. The tax system, though inconsistent, was still referenced. The language of rank still shaped interpersonal relationships. In other words, the bureaucracy no longer governed in the strict sense, but it structured thought. This had strange and lasting consequences. Even after the rise of the samurai class and the shift of power to regional warlords, Japan never fully discarded its bureaucratic ideals. The new warrior governments such as the Kamakura and Muromachi shogunates coexisted with the imperial court. They governed through separate institutions, but retained the aesthetics and language of the Ritsuryo state. Official documents continued to use formal Chinese phrasing. Seals, ranks, and appointments were issued in imitation of Heian protocols. Even samurai learned to write in the bureaucratic style, knowing that legitimacy often came not from arms, but from paperwork. This dual structure, real power and symbolic legitimacy, became a defining feature of Japanese political history. By the 12th century, the original Ritsuryo codes were no longer enforced in any serious way. But they were still copied. Students of court law called gakusho studied the codes as part of their education. Temples preserved versions of the Teiho and Yoro codes in their archives. In some cases, sections were cited in land disputes not because they held legal weight, but because they offered moral precedent. Even as new legal codes emerged adapted to samurai needs, they often began by referencing ancient formulas. The bureaucracy, though long obsolete in practice, had become a kind of political scripture. In many ways, this final phase is the most fascinating. Japan did not replace its old bureaucracy with a new one through revolution. Instead, it layered new systems over old ones, while continuing to honor the forms of the past. This layering created a culture where paperwork held almost mystical significance, where legitimacy came from documents even if those documents had no enforcement behind them, where authority flowed not only through force, but through stamps, names, and the proper phrasing of titles. The Ritsuryo state was gone, but its ghost remained whispering through archives, rituals, and habits. And so, we end our first story not with collapse, but with continuity. The Teika reforms lit the spark. The Ritsuryo codes built the framework, and though the system faded, its influence never disappeared. Like a scroll gently unrolling through time, the ideals of written governance, of knowing a country through paper, remained central to the Japanese imagination. Even in modern Japan, echoes of the ancient bureaucracy persist. The detailed application processes, the culture of stamps, hanko, the importance of titles, roles, and formalized communication. These are not accidents. They are the inheritance of 1,000 years of paperwork. And so, the real legacy of the Ritsuryo state may not be in what it governed, but in how it taught a civilization to think about governance. What happens to a state when its functions become ceremony and its rituals become culture? Is it still a government, or has it become something else entirely, a memory performed through habit? Story 2. How the Ritsuryo system governed an empire. You find yourself standing in the shadow of a quiet building in Heian-kyo, the imperial capital, sometime around the 9th century. The sun has just risen. The bells from a distant temple echo across the neatly gridded streets, and robed officials are beginning to make their way into the government complex known as the Chodo, in the heart of the bureaucracy. But this is not a scene of chaos or excitement. It is one of profound stillness, a place where authority moves slowly, wrapped in layers of paper, robes, and procedure. You are now in the world of the Ritsuryo bureaucracy in motion, not as a system of abstract laws, but as a living, breathing routine, one that runs on scrolls, stamps, and silence. This section will take you deep inside the day-to-day workings of the bureaucratic machine, the people, the tools, the structures, and the soothing monotony of a government that moved through ritualized writing. At the top of the system sits the Daijokan, the Great Council of State. This council is where policy is reviewed, appointments are proposed, and imperial edicts are drafted. It is composed of the Daijin Chancellor of the Realm, the Sadejin Minister of the Left, and the Udejin Minister of the Right. Supporting them are a wide range of junior ministers, scribes, and secretaries. But the real work, the daily, handwritten pulse of the empire, takes place in the Hassho, or 8 ministries. Each of these ministries has its own role. Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs, Jibusho, oversees rituals, court rankings, and diplomatic etiquette. Ministry of Civil Administration, Shikibusho, manages civil service appointments and education. Ministry of Popular Affairs, Minbusho, responsible for land surveys, taxation, and population records. Ministry of Military Affairs, Hayabusho, organizes conscription, weapon inventories, and defense logistics. Ministry of Justice, Jayabusho, enforces legal codes and supervises courts. Ministry of the Treasury, Okurasho, handles state finance, rice storage, and census data. Ministry of the Imperial Household, Kunaisho, coordinates internal palace operations. Ministry of the Imperial Guards, Imansho, oversees palace security and ceremonial protection. Each ministry operates as a self-contained paper world. Its rooms are quiet, lit by oil lamps. Shelves are stacked with scrolls tied with silk cords. Officials sit cross-legged on tatami mats, writing with soft brushes made from horsehair and bamboo. There is no rush, no shouting, just the endless rhythm of ink and parchment. Let us begin with the Ministry of Civil Administration, Shikibusho, often regarded as the bureaucratic soul of the court. This ministry is responsible for maintaining the official registry of ranks and titles, known as the Jinmiacho. Each appointment, promotion, and demotion is recorded by hand. Not just names, but entire family genealogies are consulted because rank is not just a matter of merit, but of bloodline. Here, scribes meticulously copy lists of court officials, writing in classical Chinese characters with perfect balance and spacing. The calligraphy is not ornamental, it is essential. Clarity and elegance reinforce legitimacy. A single smudge could cause confusion or insult. Appointments are issued as written decrees, known as senji, bearing the imperial seal or jyoji. Before a seal can be applied, the scroll must pass through a sequence of reviews, checked by junior scribes, approved by supervisors, signed by ministers. The seal itself is carved from jade or bronze and must be stored in a special wooden box, locked and witnessed by several guards. Only authorized officials may use it, and only under tightly controlled circumstances. The process of sealing is itself a ritual done in silence, with great care. Next, imagine yourself within the Ministry of Popular Affairs, Minbusho. Here, the atmosphere is slightly more chaotic. Scrolls arrive daily from the province's census reports, tax ledgers, land disputes. Everything must be catalogued, reviewed, and replied to. This ministry is responsible for calculating population figures, overseeing the land redistribution system, and managing the taxation of rice, textiles, and labor. A common document here is the Koski, the family register. Every 6 years, provincial officials are meant to send updated versions. Each person, man, woman, child is listed with name, age, and occupation. Deaths are noted, births recorded, marriages logged. The state tracks not only households but the internal lives of those households. These records are written by local scribes, then copied multiple times, once for the provincial archive, once for the central archive, and often a third copy for temple holdings, if land is involved. Mistakes are inevitable, so the ministry employs a small team of proofreaders trained in counting and cross-referencing, checking numbers against expectations. If a province reports fewer births than expected, a clerk may note it in red ink and request clarification. Corrections take months. This slow flow of information creates a time delay in governance. The capital may be acting on census data that is already 3 years old, but speed is not the point. Order is. The act of recording is what gives events their meaning. Meanwhile, at the Ministry of the Treasury Okurasho, another type of scroll dominates, the Mokuroku, or inventory ledger. This ministry keeps detailed records of the empire's wealth measured primarily in rice. All taxes, even those collected in goods, are converted into rice equivalents. The rice is stored in granaries called sero, guarded night and day. Each delivery is measured by standardized bushels. Officials note the origin of the rice, the purity, the weight, and the time of year. The records are compared against expected yields, which are calculated using previous decades' harvests. Officials carry wooden tally sticks, or satsu, to verify deliveries. These sticks are split in half, one kept by the province, one by the ministry. If they match, the delivery is verified. Every piece of information is stored in paper archives, often in large lacquered chests. These chests are sorted by region, year, and document type. Labels are written in brush script, pasted with rice glue. Dusting the archives is part of a junior clerk's weekly routine. Communication between ministries and provinces depends on a network of messengers, known as hikiaku. These couriers are not glamorous. They wear plain robes and travel light scroll pouches strapped to their backs, food tied at their waists. They sleep in roadside inns, cross rivers by ferry, and brave mountain passes in all seasons. A message from Hyankayo to Dazefu in Kyushu might take 10-14 days, depending on conditions. Scrolls are wrapped in oil paper, then tied with braided silk cord and sealed with wax. Each message carries a stamp that confirms authenticity. If the seal is broken, the message is invalid. Delays are expected. Each scroll contains not just its contents, but a record of who handled it, who opened it, and when. This metadata ensures accountability. In some cases, multiple messengers carry duplicates in case one is delayed or robbed. The cost of lost information is too high. For particularly important documents, the Imperial Secretariat manages the process. Known as the Curadatokoro, this bureau handles imperial edicts and high-level reports. They use thicker scrolls, with special ink made from pine soot and silk binding cords dyed in court-approved colors. The scrolls are passed between officials in wooden trays, never by hand. Each official bows before opening the tray, reads the document aloud, then signs with a personal seal, not a name, but a glyph pressed into soft wax. The secretary then re-rolls the scroll, places it back in the tray, and covers it with a silk cloth before it moves to the next stage. No voice is raised, no action is rushed. The entire process feels more like a ceremony than administration. This slow, careful, methodical bureaucracy has consequences. On the one hand, it creates tremendous inefficiency. Messages take weeks, decisions are delayed, corruption slips through the cracks. But on the other hand, it creates a society where nothing is arbitrary. Every role has its place, every scroll has its shelf, every action is remembered. It is a system built not for speed, but for continuity, a way of making the state present in every corner of the realm, even if only in ink. To the people working within it, it does not feel dysfunctional. It feels comforting, predictable, knowable. And so within these ministries, day after day, scroll after scroll, Japan is governed. Not by charisma, not by conquest, but by ink, routine, and the invisible belief that order can be made real through words. The bureaucrats may not hold swords, but they shape the empire all the same through margins and seals, dates and titles, names and numbers. And as the ink dries on yet another population register, copied in triplicate, stored in a labeled chest, and filed by region, one wonders. When a scroll is read 1,000 miles from where it was written, is that not a kind of presence? Can paper alone hold a nation together? Imagine for a moment that you are holding a tightly rolled scroll in your hands. It is wrapped in oiled paper, tied with a red silk cord, and bears a wax seal marked with the imperial emblem, a stylized chrysanthemum, or perhaps a phoenix, elegant, ceremonial, and final. This scroll is not merely a document. It is a proxy for imperial authority. It represents a command, a tax order, a promotion, a land survey, or a criminal judgment. Once sealed, its words are not to be questioned. And yet, for those words to mean anything, they must arrive intact, authenticated, and correctly interpreted. This is the hidden core of the Ritsurio bureaucracy, the control of distance through documentation, the act of governing not only through writing, but through movement of couriers, seals, tokens, and trust. In this section, we travel with the message itself, following it from the inner halls of the capital to the farthest provinces. Through it, we come to understand how the machinery of bureaucracy reached beyond walls through fragile, time-bound means. The sacred seal, authority in wax and bronze. The power of a message begins with its seal. In the Ritsurio system, seals are not simply tools, they are ritualized instruments of power. Every high office has its own seal, engraved in reverse with classical Chinese characters. These seals are made from stone, wood, bronze, or sometimes jade. Each has a prescribed shape and size, listed in official regulation scrolls. The most revered is the imperial seal Jyoji, used only on documents issued directly from the emperor. The physical seal is kept under guard in a lacquered box, placed in a room with restricted access. Its use must be witnessed by multiple officials. Before the seal can be pressed into the wax, the document must be read aloud, line by line, checked for error, and approved. Then, using a small brazier, a scribe warms the wax, softens it onto the knot of the scroll, and presses the seal gently but firmly. A cloth is used to blot the excess. Once dried, the seal cannot be replaced without evidence of tampering. Even minor officials have personal seals, small square or round stamps called inkan. These are required for every note, approval, or reply. In fact, an unsigned memo carries no weight at all. The bureaucratic world is bound not by voices, but by seals. To forge a seal is not merely a crime, it is considered an attack on the order of the state. Couriers of the realm, the human infrastructure of communication. Once sealed, the scroll enters a different world, one of roads, weather, and human legs. The Ritsurio bureaucracy depended on a class of professional couriers known as hikyaku, Chinese letter, literally, flying feet. These men were trained not only in endurance, but in discretion and ritual handling of documents. A typical courier carried multiple scrolls in a lacquered tube or leather pouch, fastened tightly across his back. Food was carried in a side bag: rice cakes, dried persimmons, and salt. In colder seasons, a thicker hemp cloak was permitted. Couriers wore no identifying uniform; their anonymity was part of their protection. The roads they followed were part of the kokudo, or official state routes. These roads were rudimentary, often narrow, muddy, and impassable in winter. Rivers required ferries. Mountains required switchbacks. Along the way, couriers stopped at official post stations, ekiden, spaced roughly every 10-20 kilometers. These stations were staffed with support personnel who provided fresh horses or walking assistance if terrain required portage, warm food, and lodging. Each station kept a logbook, noting the time of courier arrival, the direction of travel, and the type of message being carried: urgent, ceremonial, tax-related. Delays were entered into the log. If a courier was late by more than 2 days without cause, an investigation was triggered. The speed of trust, verification in the provinces. When the scroll reaches the provincial capital, usually governed by a kokushi, provincial governor, it does not go directly into effect. First, it must be authenticated. This is done by matching seals against official seal registers stored in the local archive. These registers include impression samples known as inkan shomisho and records of valid stamp usage. In practice, provincial scribes lay out a reference document next to the scroll. They inspect the calligraphy, compare spacing, and confirm the seal. If everything matches, the document is accepted. If there is a discrepancy, even a minor smudge, a messenger is dispatched back to the capital for clarification. This could delay action by weeks. Once authenticated, the scroll is read aloud to assembled officials. Then it is copied, often by hand, sometimes several times. One copy is kept in the provincial archive. Another is forwarded to local district administrators. A third may be sent to affiliated temples or shrines if the content involves land or ritual. Nothing happens without the scroll. Interpretation and enforcement, the bureaucrat as translator. But understanding a scroll is not always easy. Most official messages are written in classical Chinese, kanbun, the formal script of governance. Many provincial officials understand it only partially. Some rely on scribes or temple monks to translate and interpret the contents before they can take action. This creates a quiet power: the scribe as gatekeeper. These scribes, often lower ranking but highly literate, have the ability to interpret phrasing, resolve ambiguities, and recommend responses. A vague phrase like "rectify the boundaries" could be understood as remeasurement or enforcement or negotiation. The scribe's reading becomes the reality. In this way, the bureaucracy creates a layered network of interpretation, where power flows not only through command but through understanding. Misinterpretations are common, but as long as the proper forms are followed, the central government rarely intervenes. Obedience, after all, is not measured in results. It is measured in procedure. Scrolls as memory, archival rituals. Once processed, the scroll is not discarded. Instead, it is archived. Provincial governments and temples keep scroll libraries, where documents are categorized by type: legal, economic, ritual, region, and date. These archives are stored in dry, elevated rooms with raised floors to prevent humidity. Scrolls are wrapped in cloth and labeled with date tabs, thin wooden tags inscribed with sumi ink. Archival clerks have one job: to keep the past accessible. Every few decades, a document review is held. Older scrolls are checked for condition, and duplicates may be retired, but rarely are records destroyed. Even expired tax orders or resolved disputes are kept as precedent. This is how legal memory develops. When a new case arises, a boundary conflict, a rice quota, a temple claim, scribes dig through scrolls to find similar situations. The presence of a seal from 60 years ago can sway a decision today. Paper does not forget. Fragility of control, distance, delay, and disobedience. For all this structure, the bureaucracy faces a simple reality. Distance erodes control. A scroll may take 3 weeks to reach a province. A reply might take just as long. In that time, a harvest may fail. A flood may destroy a bridge. A local official may choose to act first and report later. This is especially true in remote provinces Tohoku in the north, or the southern Kyushu regions. In some cases, governors delay implementation of unpopular orders and send messages requesting clarification, knowing it will buy them time. In effect, the system allows for a kind of performative obedience. Documents are received, logged, stamped, and copied even when not followed to the letter. The capital may suspect, but as long as the form is correct, intervention is rare. This reveals a paradox at the heart of the Ritsurio system. Bureaucracy maintains control not by force, but by ritual. Temples and the mirror bureaucracy. It is not only state officials who handle scrolls. Buddhist temples, particularly large institutions like Tadaji and Enryakuji, develop their own parallel bureaucracies. They issue scrolls, maintain population records, and even negotiate tax exemptions with the court. Temple archives are often more complete than provincial ones. Monks keep meticulous ledgers of land donations, grain production, and tenant obligations. These are written in a blend of kanban and phonetic glosses to aid reading. When disputes arise, temple clerks produce scrolls from generations past, sealed, dated, and untouched by time. Their argument is simple: the paper proves our claim. In a society where the written word is sacred, this becomes an unbeatable defense. Final reflections: the paper empire. And so we return to that sealed scroll in your hand. By the time it completes its journey through hands, roads, rivers, mines, and rituals, it has become more than a message. It is a performance of the state, a tangible reassurance that the world still follows rules, that the capital still matters, that the emperor still reigns. In truth, the bureaucracy often fails to enforce its will, but it never fails to remember, and in that memory lies its real power. Scrolls do not expire. They rest in cedar boxes, labeled and stored, waiting to be read again. And one day, a minor official in a distant province will unroll an old message and find the signature of a long-dead minister, the faded ink of a forgotten law, and a seal pressed carefully into red wax. He will pause, bow slightly, and begin to copy it. Because the bureaucracy never truly ends, it only continues in loops of paper and echoes of command. Can a government persist not through action, but through the unbroken ritual of remembering itself? Is the scroll still powerful if its message is no longer enforced, or is memory the most lasting form of power? The scrolls, the stamps, the ministries, they are all born in Heian-kyo, the glowing capital city laid out in right-angled perfection. But that is not where most of Japan lives. Beyond the capital walls lie provinces, districts, villages, and fields where ink still arrives, but authority arrives more slowly. In this final section, we step away from the central ministries and into the countryside, where bureaucracy becomes something embodied, lived, and quietly adapted. It is in these dusty offices and rural temples that the grand structures of the Ritsurio state begin to evolve, sometimes unravel, sometimes endure. And in doing so, they leave a different kind of legacy, one that lives not in power but in habit. Provincial government, the office at the edge. Each province, kuni, under the Ritsurio system was governed by a kokushi, a state-appointed provincial governor. These men, often drawn from the mid-level aristocracy, served terms of about 4 years and were assigned to regions they did not come from, in an attempt to prevent local alliances or favoritism. They were given their appointments in the capital complete with seal, scroll, and official clothing, and then traveled with their entourage to the provincial capital Kokufu, often many weeks away. Their arrival was ceremonial. They were to present themselves at the provincial temple, report to local officials, and begin the slow process of assessing the local situation. Their job was not glamorous. The Kokushi was expected to collect taxes, oversee census registers, resolve disputes between landholders, maintain post roads and bridges, write reports to the central government, coordinate religious festivals, approve temple exemptions. But their real challenge was making the system work with limited tools. They had few soldiers. They relied on local Gunji hereditary district officials who often had their own power bases. Many documents were late, some never arrived. And yet day by day they wrote, read, reviewed, and recorded. Bureaucracy here was more negotiation than command. The Gunji, hereditary middle managers. Beneath the Kokushi stood the Gunji, or district magistrates, often local landowners or descendants of powerful clans who had been co-opted into the bureaucratic system. They held their positions informally, often passing them down within the family, but were responsible for most of the day-to-day work. Compiling census registers, koski, supervising land measurement and taxation, organizing labor for public works, delivering messages to neighboring districts. The Gunji often had scribes of their own, many of them monks or literate family retainers. These men would spend their days copying tax records, calculating quotas, and preparing summaries for the Kokushi to forward to Heian-kyo. Scrolls were stored in wooden trunks, seals were locked in clay jars, ledger tables were marked with counters, tally sticks, and ink pots made from shell and soot. The work was slow and there was little reward, but for many rural elites, bureaucracy was the language of power. To participate in paperwork meant to be acknowledged by the state, to have standing, to be remembered. Peasants in paper, the bureaucracy on the ground. For the average peasant, bureaucracy was something that arrived seasonally, like a migrating bird or a storm. Once a year, an official or agent of the Gunji would visit the village with a scroll pouch, a measuring rope, and a tablet for census questions. He would note the number of adult males, the number of children, the location and size of fields, grain yields, any absences, deaths, or marriages. These visits were formal but predictable. Farmers presented offerings: dried fish, fermented rice, bundles of straw. They confirmed their family details. They received their obligations for the year, tax amounts in rice or cloth, required labor days for roads or granaries or militia training. Most peasants were illiterate, but many recognized the structure of the scrolls. The seals, the cords, the red ink for corrections, the black ink for census tallies. To the peasant, the scroll was not just paper. It was the state given physical form. It could not be reasoned with or avoided, only endured. Temples as bureaucratic anchors. In many provinces, the temple was the real center of administrative continuity. Temples served as repositories for land records, providers of scribes, mediators in tax disputes, holders of scroll copies. Why temples? Because they had trained monks who could read and write in Kanban, had legal exemptions that made them hard to challenge, and had landed estates of their own to protect. It was common for the Kokushi or Gunji to consult temple records when investigating ownership claims. A head monk might unroll a 70-year-old donation scroll, point to a seal still intact, and settle the matter without violence. Temples also helped with education. Sons of rural elites were sometimes sent to train at temples not for religious ordination, but to learn reading, calligraphy, and numeracy. In this way, bureaucracy became part of temple culture, and temples became unwitting civil service schools. Local adaptation, when the scroll stops working. Over time, the ideal of a tightly integrated, centrally directed bureaucracy gave way to local flexibility. As early as the 9th century, many Kokushi found it more effective to delegate, ignore, or reinterpret central orders. Instead of following redistribution laws, they allowed farmers to stay on their inherited land. Instead of sending tax quotas exactly, they offered lump sum payments in return for fewer inspections. Some provinces created summary registers, simplified versions of the full census, written in colloquial script, for internal use. Others bundled multiple years of tax ledgers into a single scroll, marked only with totals and minimal annotations. To the capital, these compromises were invisible. The scrolls kept coming. The seals were applied. The bureaucracy lived on. But in practice, local knowledge overruled distant policy. The forms remained, the function adapted. The rise of the clerk, a new class of quiet power. By the 10th century, the bureaucracy had created a new kind of social actor, the provincial scribe or hikin. These clerks were often low status but indispensable. They knew how to compose documents in formal style, use seals properly, copy scrolls legibly and quickly, interpret ambiguous instructions, avoid offending powerful local families. They often served as advisors to the gunji, ghostwriters for the kokushi, or intermediaries with temples. Unlike court aristocrats, they held no noble rank, but their literacy gave them access to decision-making. They became unofficial brokers of bureaucratic knowledge, whispering to governors what could be said and how to say it. Sometimes, a particularly skilled clerk could dominate a provincial office, drafting all correspondence, forging helpful alliances, and quietly altering scrolls to suit the political moment. They rarely appear in the great histories, but their brushwork shaped real outcomes. Ritual bureaucracy, when memory replaces enforcement. By the end of the 10th century, the scrolls still move, the seals still press, the messages still arrive. But most of the original enforcement mechanisms, redistribution, corvée labor, conscription, have weakened or vanished. In their place is ritual. Census scrolls are still filled out, even when births and deaths go uncounted. Tax quotas are still sent, though often negotiated downward. Festivals are still performed according to imperial script, even when the audience no longer listens closely. Why? Because the bureaucracy has become a culture. It is no longer just about control, it is about continuity. Each scroll, each record, each ceremonial report to the capital is a quiet assertion that Japan is still one country, that there is still a center, that the emperor still reigns, even when no one obeys. Legacy, bureaucracy as inheritance. The Ritsurio system will eventually fade, replaced by military governments, estate systems, and shogunal codes, but it will never fully disappear. Its habits endure. The meticulous copying of documents, the reverence for seals and signatures, the belief in hierarchy through titles, the reliance on ritual forms over brute enforcement. Even in Tokugawa Japan, 800 years later, village heads will still file reports using vertical scroll format, and samurai officials will settle disputes by citing precedents written centuries earlier. In this way, bureaucracy survives not through strength, but through inertia. It becomes the default shape of memory. A provincial official sits in his modest office. The sun has set. A lantern flickers beside him. On his lap is a scroll, a property dispute involving two tenants. He sighs, reaches for the inkstone, and begins to write. Not because he is told to. not because the central government is watching, but because that is what has always been done. And in the quiet weight of routine, a nation continues. When the bureaucracy no longer commands but still compels, what is it that we obey? The seal, the memory, or the shape of order itself carried forward by our own hands? Story 3. The Ministry of Ceremonies where etiquette became power. The clack of sandals on polished wooden floors, the faint scent of incense. A door slides open with perfect slowness. You are not in a battlefield. You are not in a council chamber. You are in a different kind of place, one where power wears silk and speaks in bows. This is the world of the Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs, Jibusho, one of the most quietly influential institutions of the Ritsurio state. Here, governance is not enforced by sword or decree. It is expressed through robes, language, formality, and the precisely measured tilt of a body in motion. This ministry's work is not about laws or taxes. It is about the etiquette that orders the cosmos, and by extension, society. In this section, we explore how ritual became rule, how social hierarchy was performed into reality, and how the boring details of bowing, costume, and rank ordering helped hold a nation together. The quiet authority of the Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs. The Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs, Jibusho, was established under the Ritsurio Code as one of the 8 ministries of government. And yet, its duties did not involve land, army, justice, or tax. Instead, it did the following: maintained official rank registers and court hierarchies, oversaw imperial rites and seasonal ceremonies, dictated court dress codes, supervised interactions with foreign envoys, organized the naming ceremonies of aristocrats, standardized forms of address for officials of different status. At first glance, this seems ornamental, something non-essential, perhaps even decorative. But in the Ritsurio worldview, these rituals were not mere symbols. They were the glue of the state. The principle was simple. If everyone moved correctly, the world would stay in order. Rank as a social operating system. The Jibusho was responsible for maintaining the Kani system, the formal hierarchy of government ranks. There were 30 official ranks, each divided into senior sho and junior ju levels, and most further split into upper and lower grades. For example, senior first rank sho ikiai, reserved for top ministers and at times former emperors. Junior third rank ju sanmi, a rank of distinction often held by senior courtiers. Senior sixth rank sho roku I, the highest attainable rank for many provincial officials. Junior eighth rank lower grade ju hachai no ji, the entry-level rank for low bureaucrats and messengers. But the system was not just a chart in a scroll. Rank dictated the color and cut of robes, the materials one could wear: silk, hemp, or brocade, the type of carriage one could ride, the distance from which one could speak to the emperor, the depth of a bow required when passing someone of higher rank. The ministry maintained a formal chart, and all promotions were handled with ceremony. The appointment scroll was hand-copied, sealed, and delivered in a silk pouch. Upon receiving it, the official would undergo a public ceremony, donning the appropriate new clothing, receiving congratulations, and presenting himself at court in proper form. This moment was not optional. It was the performance of legitimacy. Robes as documents. In a society governed by writing, clothing became a visible script of authority. Each rank had a designated color: deep purples and rich reds for the highest, green, indigo, and yellow-browns for the middle ranks, plain white or black for the lower classes. These were not fashion choices, they were mandated by law. The Jibusho maintained robes for ceremonial loan, especially for those who had not yet had theirs tailored. Court tailors followed official regulations: the number of sleeve folds, the width of the collar, and even the angle of the shoulder seams were all prescribed. Imagine walking into a hall where each robe tells you a person's exact place in the universe. To wear the wrong color was not just a mistake, it was a symbolic violation of order. Punishments ranged from rebuke to removal from office. The ceremony of movement. Etiquette extended beyond clothing. The Jibusho also maintained rules for how many steps one could take when approaching someone of higher status, where one could sit during banquets, ceremonies, and meetings, how deep to bow, depending on the rank of the person being greeted. This might sound excessive, but in a bureaucratic world where stability depended on recognizable structure, these movements created a kind of social infrastructure. A bow was not just a sign of respect, it was a confirmation of rank alignment. At the court, young officials were trained in these rules from childhood. Mistakes were recorded and reprimanded in writing. Some offices kept bowing diagrams, instructional scrolls showing the correct posture, angles, and hand positions. Even hand gestures were regulated. When receiving a document from a superior, one was to extend both hands, palms up, with fingers aligned. A single deviation could be interpreted as disrespect. Ceremony as diplomacy. Another critical duty of the Jibusho was overseeing foreign relations, particularly the reception of Korean and Chinese envoys. Foreign visitors were greeted with highly choreographed rituals. Their seating, the gifts they brought, the order in which they entered court all were specified by the ministry, often weeks in advance. Translators stood by with pre-written scripts. Even mispronunciations were anticipated and noted in side margins. Diplomacy was not improvisational, it was choreographed pageantry. Why such detail? Because to the Japanese court, ritual was more than performance. It was the means by which power was made legible and real. If an envoy bowed too deeply, it meant submission. If he refused ceremonial wine, it meant offense. Every detail mattered, and the Jibusho recorded them all. Naming the officials, naming the world. The Jibusho also managed naming conventions, particularly for aristocratic families and court titles. Names were not given lightly. An official name had to conform to status, lineage, and classical meaning. A new appointee to court could not simply choose a poetic alias or dramatic surname. The ministry had to approve the characters used, ensuring that no duplicate names existed and that the name did not suggest hubris or illegitimacy. In effect, the Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs created a catalog of identity. Names, like robes, became part of bureaucratic order. There were even rules for posthumous names, given to high officials upon death. These names, recorded in ancestral registers, were often poetic and encoded the person's rank and virtues. To name someone was to write their story into the record of the state. Seasonal order, the calendar of ceremonies. The ministry maintained the ritual calendar, organizing events that aligned society with the seasons, the heavens, and the imperial presence. Key events included New Year's Court Assembly, Shihohai, where officials gathered to bow before the emperor at dawn. Seasonal changing of robes, which reflected temperature and solar calendars. Choyo Festival, Double Ninth, where chrysanthemums were floated in wine to ward off evil. Annual promotion ceremony, where new ranks were announced and sealed scrolls distributed. Each event had its own prescribed incense, arrangement of courtiers, formulas of greeting, and even floor layouts. Nothing was left to improvisation. The point of the ritual was not excitement, it was continuity. Ritual as power without violence. What is most remarkable about the Jibusho is how it managed to wield enormous soft power. An official without military strength could still exclude someone from the court, simply by denying them access to the correct robes or refusing to list their name in the rank register. To not be listed was to not exist. This system created a culture of internal policing. Officials enforced etiquette not out of fear, but because to fail at ceremony was to lose one's place in society. A bureaucrat who did not know the correct order of bows might be passed over for promotion. A provincial governor who received an envoy incorrectly might be recalled. Ritual thus became a subtle but binding form of control, flexible in appearance, but unforgiving in application. When the ritual outlives the rule, over time, the actual enforcement power of the jibusho declined, especially as military rule overtook the ceremonial court in later centuries. And yet the ministry was never abolished. Even as samurai rose to power, court ceremonies continued. Aristocrats with no real land or army still wore robes, still attended rituals, still bowed and addressed one another in ancient forms. The ministry became a memory of order, preserved through habit. And remarkably, many of its rules echoed far into the future. Even today, in modern Japanese society, bowing retains degrees of formality. Business attire is coded by seniority and occasion. Speech levels and honorifics keigo map directly to hierarchical distinctions. Family naming conventions and seasonal rituals maintain roots in court practice. The ministry may have faded, but its grammar of etiquette continues to shape how people move through space and society. A young clerk walks through the corridor of the ceremonial hall. His hands tremble slightly as he adjusts his robe, deep green silk, signifying his new sixth-rank appointment. He bows at the entrance to the ritual chamber, stepping precisely to the third mat and waits in silence. His name will be called. He will kneel, accept a scroll, bow, and exit. The act will take less than 5 minutes. And yet, in those 5 minutes, he will have entered the structure of the world. When a state enforces obedience not through laws or armies, but through silence, posture, and fabric, is it still power? Or has it become something more permanent? The year turns slowly in Heian-kyo. Plum blossoms fall in the 2nd month. The rains of the 5th month stain the tiled roofs. Cicadas hum over the capital in the 7th. And through each season, the rituals of the court unfold precisely as they always have, guided by scroll, calendar, and the invisible hand of the Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs. This section draws you deeper into the seasonal architecture of the bureaucracy, where ritual is not only a reflection of harmony, but a tool of control and a stage for subtle competition. In a world without elections or parliaments, posture becomes persuasion, and silence can speak volumes. As the central government's power begins to fragment, it is this choreography of etiquette, this ceaseless movement of bows, robes, gifts, and titles that preserves the illusion of unity. An empire may falter, but its ceremonies do not. The ceremonial calendar, when time belonged to the state. To understand the ministry's true influence, you must understand its calendar, not the simple cycle of days, but a year structured by imperial ritual. The Ritsuryo court, and the Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs in particular, maintained a detailed annual schedule of formal events, many of which were required appearances for aristocrats and court officials. Each event had practical, symbolic, and political implications. A few highlights include Shihohai New Year's morning worship. The emperor, flanked by high ministers, faced the 4 cardinal directions and bowed to the gods, calling on cosmic harmony to bless the nation. Attendance and placement was a public affirmation of one's standing in the bureaucracy. Sechi seasonal banquets, held several times a year, these were both celebrations and tests. Officials were seated according to rank, served different foods, and observed for any misstep in etiquette. Choyo no Seku, Double Ninth Festival, a ritual purification and poetry competition held on the 9th day of the 9th month. Courtiers floated chrysanthemum petals in wine and composed verses not just for art's sake, but to demonstrate refinement, memory, and grace under protocol. Bureaucracy, ancestral rites, ceremonies honoring imperial ancestors. Participation was less about piety and more about political alignment with the imperial line. Each ritual was a kind of soft census, revealing who had influence, who was absent, who hesitated, and who bowed too deeply or too late. Political theater in a world of form. From the outside, these rituals may seem repetitive, even dull, but to those inside, they were fields of competition as sharp as any battlefield, only quieter. In the High Court, advancement depended less on accomplishments than on navigating ceremonial space. This meant being seen in the right robes at the right time, offering the correct seasonal gifts to senior officials, quoting Confucian or Buddhist texts at the proper moment in formal speech, demonstrating fluency in courtly behavior, including how long to linger at an audience chamber door before entering. The Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs did not just oversee these acts, it recorded them. Minor breaches of protocol were quietly noted. Successes were mentioned in annual reports to the emperor. A young official who bowed a moment too soon at a New Year's audience might find his name missing from the next appointment list. Those who mastered this dance often rose far, even without land or soldiers. These were the true aristocrats of paper and posture. The gift economy, etiquette as exchange. Another subtle lever of control was the gift system, governed in part by ceremonial norms enforced by the ministry. Every season had its appropriate gifts. In spring, silk fans, ink stones, and perfume pouches. In summer, woven cloths and pickled plum. In autumn, moon-viewing poetry scrolls. In winter, salted fish, sake, or ornamental pine branches. These were not simply acts of generosity, they were coded communications. For instance, sending a fan of superior quality to a higher-ranking official could be interpreted as ambition. Not sending a gift at all could be seen as insult. A well-timed gift could curry favor, secure a marriage alliance, or smooth over an unspoken error in ceremony. Though unofficial, the ministry's staff took note of such exchanges. Couriers who carried the gifts might also carry whispers of political maneuvering. Etiquette was not merely outward behavior, it was the diplomacy of status. Ceremony as the last bastion of the capital. As Japan's political landscape began to decentralize with provincial lords and temples gaining real power, the central court in Heian-kyo gradually lost the ability to enforce policy. Yet it retained ceremonial authority. When a regional governor received a new seal of office, it was still bestowed through a ministry-managed ceremony. When a warrior sought recognition, he might request a title that aligned him with the ancient ranks recorded by the Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs. Even those who no longer needed the court's permission sought its acknowledgement. This created a strange but stable dynamic, power governed by arms but legitimacy granted by robes. A daimyo might rule his domain by force, but he would send a gift to the capital in time for the New Year's banquet, hopping for mention in the ceremonial records. The emperor as ritual, not ruler. By the 10th and 11th centuries, emperors themselves had become ritual figures. Real governance was in the hands of regents, retired emperors, or powerful clans like the Fujiwara. But the Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs continued to choreograph every imperial movement with exacting care. The emperor's annual appearances were rare, but each was layered with meaning. The color of his robe. The incense burned as he entered. The number of times he turned before seating. The specific court music performed. To see the emperor even at a distance was to witness cosmological legitimacy. Even those who doubted the state's power did not doubt its rituals. The emperor, enclosed by formality, became not just a person, but a ceremonial constant, an axis around which bureaucratic etiquette revolved. when form becomes memory. Eventually, as the centuries turned and samurai governments took hold, many of the practical functions of the ministry faded, yet the ceremonial calendar persisted. Why? Because even when the system no longer governed directly, people remembered how it had governed. They remembered. That authority came in layers. That position could be recognized by behavior. That legitimacy could be confirmed through performance. Thus, the bureaucratic etiquette of the Ritsurio state lived on not as law, but as habit, culture, and expectation. Monks continued to bow in rank order. Retired officials maintained court robes for festival days. Even provincial lords invited scribes to record family rituals in proper kanban format. Ceremony, once the outward language of the state, had become the inner language of status. The whispering power of ceremony. A man walks into the court hall. He wears a robe of dark blue, the color of junior fifth rank. He holds his fan at mid-torso, neither too high nor too low. He pauses, bows with perfect precision, and kneels in silence. He speaks only when spoken to. He cites a Confucian phrase to explain a modest administrative proposal. He exits with a backward glance and an unbroken posture. No law has changed. No army has moved. And yet in this single performance, power has shifted slightly, invisibly but undeniably. This is the world the Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs built. Not a government of force, but a society of expectation, repetition, and quiet control. When law is forgotten but ritual is remembered, is the ceremony still a form of rule? Can a society obey without knowing it obeys, simply by following the paths laid down in its posture, clothing, and tone? As the Heian period fades and the age of warriors rises, the robed courtiers of the Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs remain. Their offices grow quieter. Their scrolls grow longer. The court becomes more removed from power. But its rituals, the careful bows, the seasonal robes, the ranks of color and posture do not vanish. Instead, they diffuse outward, embedding themselves in Japanese life long after the bureaucracy that created them has lost control. This is the quiet power of etiquette, not that it commands, but that it persists. Even when no one remembers the scrolls, people still remember how to bow. In this final section, we explore how the ministry's cultural engineering, so slow, so methodical, so boring, shaped not only the imperial court, but the habits of an entire civilization. What began as bureaucracy becomes behavior, and what began as ritual becomes identity. The samurai and the robe, when warriors inherited ritual. As the court's political authority declined in the 12th and 13th centuries, military governments, first the Kamakura, then the Muromachi, began to rule Japan through force, landholding, and personal loyalty. Yet even the samurai, born of steel and battlefield oath, could not escape the gravity of form. When a warlord needed to legitimize his position, he sought court titles such as Shikin Regent or Shogun, barbarian subduing general. Court robes tailored to rank and regulation. Participation in ceremonies, especially those tied to New Year rites or temple dedications. The Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs, though largely symbolic by now, still issued documents of confirmation. These were copied by clerks, sealed with the imperial crest, and delivered by official messengers. To appear in the Heian court, even as a warrior, was to become part of the ritual world. You were measured not by your sword, but by how you stood, what you wore, and what titles you bore. The samurai adopted this posture eagerly because it offered prestige, and prestige offered continuity. The performing state, ritual without rule. By the Muromachi period, 14th-16th centuries, the court was nearly powerless. Yet it continued to perform the seasonal calendar of rituals, with the Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs directing the ceremonies much as it had centuries earlier. This persistence created what historians sometimes call a performing state. There were no taxes, yet land registers were still updated. No armies, yet promotion ceremonies were still held. No enforcement, yet robes and ranks still changed with the calendar. What then was the purpose? The answer is simple: cultural continuity. The ministry was not preserving governance anymore. It was preserving the memory of order, one bow, one scroll, one festival at a time. Even rival factions and military clans honored this memory. They sent gifts, observed ceremonial dress codes, and used imperial language in their proclamations. Ceremony had become a kind of neutral space, where power could be negotiated symbolically even as real authority lay elsewhere. Temples and tea, the ritual mind beyond the court. As court culture seeped outward, temples became another vessel for ceremonial habit. Monks observed dress codes by sect, seasonal rituals aligned with court festivals, formal seating arrangements during sermons, scripted correspondence with both the court and samurai lords. But the most powerful conduit of ceremonial thinking was not the temple, it was the tea house. The rise of the tea ceremony, chanoyu, in the late medieval period saw a new kind of etiquette emerge, one rooted in simplicity, silence, and precise movement. Here, too, we see echoes of the ministry. Specific rules for guest seating, prescribed language and timing of compliments, required seasonal adaptations of utensil and scroll decorations, hierarchy of hosts and guests performed wordlessly. Even in this private, almost spiritual act, the ritual grammar of the old court lived on. Language and legacy, the ghost of court etiquette in modern times. Fast forward to modern Japan, and you can still find the fingerprint of the Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs not in government buildings, but in language, posture, and tone. Japanese has one of the most complex systems of honorific speech, keigo, in the world, with subtle distinctions based on hierarchy, formality, and context. Business cards are exchanged with both hands and a slight, bow and echo of the courtly scroll handoff. Meetings begin with ritual phrases, often mirrored from classical formulaic speech. Seating in trains, boardrooms, and taxis follows invisible status rules: window side for higher status, door side for lower. Even the seasonal greetings in letters, such as "with the lingering heat of early autumn," derive from formal court openings. These are not coincidences. They are residues of a ceremonial worldview passed through habit more than memory. The robes may be gone, but the rhythm remains. The ministry's quiet final years. The Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs continued to exist in some form until the late 19th century, surviving the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate and the rise of the Meiji state. In 1869, as Japan modernized under Western models, the ministry was finally dissolved and reorganized under new bureaucratic categories. But even in dissolution, it left instructions for the preservation of ritual scrolls, the transfer of court dress regulations to the new government, the adaptation of seasonal ceremonies into national festivals. Meiji bureaucrats, trained in modern governance, still wore Western suits cut with seasonal sensibility, observed bowing protocols, and continued to use honorifics derived from the Heian court. The old ceremonial framework had become cultural software, running silently in the background of a modern state. The last scrolls. In an archive in Kyoto, there still exist handwritten manuals from the Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs, some dating back 900 years. Their pages are filled with descriptions of robes never worn again, diagrams of ceremonies long forgotten, names of officials who lived and died without changing history. And yet there is a weight to these scrolls. Because they represent not grand decisions or famous battles, but something far more enduring: the belief that order could be made visible, that power could be felt in silence, and that a bow could bind a nation. A young court clerk, centuries ago, kneels at a low desk. He is writing instructions for a flower arrangement to be placed in the hall of autumn ceremonies. He uses a brush of horsehair and a rhythm passed down through generations. He will never rule a province or lead an army, but his handwriting, if done correctly, will determine how 30 officials stand in relation to one another. That, in the Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs, is power enough. What is the legacy of a government that ruled not through laws, but through habits? When the scroll is gone but the behavior remains, who or what is really governing? Story 4. The Paper Empire Record-Keeping in Nara and Heian, Japan. It begins, as most things in early Japan did, with a scroll. Not a proclamation, not a poem, not a dramatic tale of battle, but a ledger. A scroll of rice quotas, copied in 3 hands, labeled in the margin with the name of the province, the date of compilation, and a notation, to be preserved indefinitely. The string that binds it is rough from use. The ink is slightly faded, brown where it should be black. This is not a lost treasure. It is not beautiful. It is not even particularly legible. And yet it is indispensable. This is the foundation of what would become Japan's earliest bureaucratic archives, a quiet infrastructure of paper, brush, and shelf that, more than any sword or emperor, held the empire together. In this story, we enter the quietest corners of the state, the storerooms, record halls, and scribe rooms of the Nara and early Heian periods, places where bureaucrats worked in near silence, copying, labeling, categorizing, and in doing so, inventing the Japanese state's memory. Because no order can exist unless it can be remembered. The scribes of Nara, memory in ink. In the 8th century, as Japan formally embraced the Ritsuryo system and built its capital at Nara Hijokaya, the bureaucracy required something new: permanence. Temples had their sutras, the court had its ceremonies, but for a government to function across decades, it needed a system for holding onto its decisions. This need created a new class of public servant, the archive scribe. These were not the same scribes who copied poems or edicts. These were specialists trained in brushwork and layout, familiar with filing conventions, and fluent in the clerical language of bureaucratic kanban. Their jobs were to copy documents for storage, to label scrolls accurately and uniformly, to maintain catalogs of scroll holdings, to preserve, clean, and when necessary recopy deteriorating texts. Their work took place in a special area of government complexes called the Kyoto, or document hall, part library, part office, part sanctuary of stillness. The architecture of storage. Scrolls were stored in wooden boxes or drawers, stacked on low shelving made of lacquered cypress. Each scroll was wrapped in protective cloth, secured with cords, and labeled with a thin bamboo or wooden tag, futa, that listed the title of the scroll, the origin, e.g., Ministry of Popular Affairs, the year of creation or last update, a brief description, e.g., tax collections, Harima province. These labels were hung off the scroll's edge, so clerks could browse without unrolling each one. The scrolls were arranged by ministry, then by document type, and finally by year, a system inspired by Chinese archives, but adapted for Japanese scale and record density. Most documents were written in vertical kanban, on washi paper made from mulberry bark. Ink was made fresh daily, a slow grinding process involving soot and animal glue, mixed on a slate stone and carefully managed to avoid excess thickness. The climate in Nara was humid. Scrolls were subject to mold and insects. To prevent decay, archives were often built on raised floors with ventilated eaves. Some scrolls were aired annually and dusted with powdered incense to deter pests. The result was a space designed for silence and patience where memory was stored not in stone, but in soft, impermanent materials preserved through habit. Categorizing the empire, what was stored? The state generated documents constantly. In a single year, a scribe might copy or archive census scrolls Koski from every province, listing names, ages, and occupations. Land registers Denbucho, showing field measurements and ownership. Tax records in rice, cloth, or tools. Promotions and appointments with imperial seals. Monastic land grants with maps sketched in ink. Dispute resolutions, often annotated with counterarguments in red. Seasonal rituals, documenting attendance, seating, and gifts exchanged. Nothing was too minor. Even delivery logs from imperial storehouses were kept recording how many bolts of silk arrived, how many baskets of grain were opened, and when the last inspection took place. To read the archive was to read the rhythm of the state day by day, sack by sack, breath by bureaucratic breath. The life of a scroll. A scroll's life began as a draft written on rougher paper, full of corrections and edits. Once finalized, the text was copied cleanly by a copyist trained in standard handwriting styles. The final scroll was compared against the original, verified by a supervisor, and then sealed with a minor official's mark, often in red ink or stamped wax. It was then labeled, cataloged, and placed into storage. Every scroll had a retention period. Some were marked temporary, rinji, to be destroyed or repurposed after a decade. Others were permanent, jakyu, to be stored indefinitely. Once a year, a scroll review, kansatsu, was conducted. Clerks aired the scrolls, checked their legibility, and copied any that showed signs of decay. The originals were sometimes burned in quiet rituals, returning memory to ash. Nothing was wasted. Even used scrolls could be repurposed as backing paper, used to bind ledgers or wrap official gifts. Archives as authority. But the archive was not just a storage space, it was a source of authority. When a land dispute arose, the parties could petition the court to retrieve the original field allocation scroll from decades earlier. The presence of a seal, a date, and a name in the records was often enough to end an argument. In this sense, the archive replaced the witness. It became a silent court, a place where memory stood in for testimony, and paper carried the weight of truth. Temples quickly recognized this power. Many kept their own archives, often more complete than the state, and used them to defend property, exemptions, or privileges. Monks trained in bureaucratic style became record custodians, blending religious authority with administrative literacy. In some cases, a provincial governor could lose jurisdiction over a field simply because the temple had a better scroll. The bureaucratic cartographers. Among the most valued documents were maps drawn on long scrolls, often measuring several meters when fully unrolled. These were not modern maps, but field diagrams showing boundaries between paddy plots, names of tenant farmers, waterways and irrigation canals, distances calculated by foot travel, not scale. Such maps were copied regularly. When a new survey was conducted, the results were written alongside the older sketch, allowing officials to track changes over time. These scrolls turned the landscape into a readable, governable object. They also gave rise to land disputes because multiple versions of the same map often circulated. Scribal inconsistencies or overlapping claims made the archive a place of tension, not just record. One scribe's brushstroke could determine generations of ownership. The loneliness of the scribe. Scribes and archivists rarely appear in history books. They lived modest lives, often working in dim rooms, hunched over desks, their backs bent, their brushstrokes methodical. They were not praised for creativity, but for consistency. And yet without them, no tax could be collected, no order could be enforced. no temple could defend its holdings. They were the custodians of continuity. Some left quiet notes in the margins. Copied in haste, forgive errors. This is the third copy made this month. Seal faded, replaced with verbal confirmation. These whispers remind us, the archive was not only a system, it was a human labor, one requiring patience, discipline, and a belief that what one wrote might matter, even if no one ever read it again. The paper empire. In the end, what did Japan become under this system? Not just a nation of emperors or warriors, but a nation of records. A country that measured itself through ink, that governed through scrolls, that defined land, people, status, and time through documents carefully labeled, stored, and preserved. Even when politics failed, the archive endured. And today, in temples and universities, some of these scrolls remain, rolled tight in lacquered boxes, their edges frayed, their ink faded, but still legible, still waiting, still remembering. When memory is recorded on fragile paper, and yet survives centuries, what does that say about the power of silence? Is it possible that a government's true legacy is not what it built, but what it stored and who took the time to copy it, again and again? Far from the capital, past rice fields and low mountain paths, a stone lantern flickers beside the gate of a provincial temple. The hour is late. Inside, a single monk sits before a wooden desk, the soft light of oil lamp illuminating a clean sheet of washi. His inkstone is ready. His brush is trimmed. His fingers hover in the air for just a moment, then descend in smooth, deliberate strokes. He is not copying scripture tonight. He is copying a tax exemption decree from the imperial court. For centuries, this quiet labor, the duplication of scrolls, the transcription of records, the careful preservation of seals and dates would make temples the guardians of memory in early Japan. In this section, we follow the paper trail into monastic libraries, explore the rise of scribal culture as both spiritual discipline and political function, and consider how the act of copying became a form of power all its own. Why temples became archives. In the Ritsuryo state, secular ministries were tasked with maintaining the official record, but they faced practical challenges, limited resources, changing personnel, and the decay of early materials in Japan's humid climate. Provincial offices, especially, struggled to retain complete records. Temples, however, had stable populations of literate monks, physical infrastructure protected from conflict, longevity beyond political appointments, a culture already committed to preservation and copying. As a result, temples became natural custodians of state records, especially those relating to land donations, tax exemptions, disputes over field boundaries, copies of census registers and family rolls, koski, festival participation, and ritual obligations. In some regions, the local temple's version of a scroll was more trusted than the governor. The structure of the temple archive. Larger temples such as Tadaiji in Nara or in Ryakuji near Kyoto maintained dedicated archive halls, often called shoso, meaning treasure house or storehouse. These were constructed with raised floors and thick wooden beams, designed to be fire-resistant and moisture-controlled, outfitted with shelf box systems soko that allowed for vertical stacking of scroll bundles. Scrolls were tied with silk cords and stored in categories. Shaman administrative documents. Shuenjo imperial edicts with red seals. Nenju Jyoji annual ritual calendars. Toji Denbun land registry maps and yield reports. Hancho Mashijo petitions and complaints. Labels were updated annually. Fragile scrolls were recopied, with the original sometimes sealed in oil paper and placed in a secondary chest to be used only in disputes. The monks tasked with maintaining these scrolls were known as kyoji, or sutra clerks, though many handled secular documents with equal reverence. Copying as a ritual practice. Copying was not a casual act. It was governed by ritual protocols, especially within Buddhist monasteries. Before beginning, the monk would wash his hands in a purification basin, light incense to calm the mind and honor the spirits of the past, recite a short verse, often invoking a bodhisattva of wisdom or memory, unroll the scroll and inspect it for damage, then sit in the seiza position before beginning the first stroke. Each brushstroke was deliberate. Errors were to be crossed with a single red line, not erased to preserve the document's lineage. The act of copying itself became a form of meditation, a merging of bureaucratic discipline and spiritual focus. Some monks would work in silence for hours, transcribing land dispute records, tax letters sent to noble families, names of tenants on temple-held fields, lists of seasonal rice deliveries. Even these boring documents were treated with care, because to copy was to witness. Scrolls in competition, whose memory was stronger. As more temples became powerful landholders, their archives became weapons in legal and political disputes. Imagine this: two parties claim the same rice field. One presents a court-issued scroll from 20 years ago. The other, a temple, presents the same document but accompanied by a second copy with older handwriting, a copy of the original donation ledger, a sketch map marked with tenant names, a petition submitted by ancestors. Suddenly, the temple's claim is more credible, not because of force, but because of paperwork. It has more layers of memory. This created an arms race of archival credibility. Scribes who could trace document lineages, maintain correct seals, and detect forgeries became highly sought after, not only in temples, but in provincial governments and elite families. The record was no longer just a copy. It was a narrative of preservation. The scribes between worlds. By the 9th and 10th centuries, a distinct class of lay scribes emerged, not monks, not court aristocrats, but paper artisans of the bureaucracy. They worked freelance or under contract. Some were attached to temples. Others moved between provincial offices and estate managers. Their skill set included calligraphic fluency in multiple bureaucratic hands, knowledge of legal formulae, honorifics, and address conventions, familiarity with archival structures so their copies could be filed correctly, the ability to forge or mimic older documents, sometimes legally, sometimes not. These scribes often added small margin notes, indicating when and why they had copied a document. One such note, dated to the 10th century, reads, "This is the second copy, the original lost to fire, preserved here for temple record, verified by the monk Ryakai." Such notes became critical. They gave documents a chain of custody, a sense of reliability grounded not in law, but in reputation. Copying as resistance. Sometimes, copying was not only about preservation, it was a form of protest. When a provincial lord tried to seize temple land, monks would often recite ancestral donations aloud in ritual halls, copy relevant scrolls, and send them to the capital, circulate scrolls among neighboring temples to build support, annotate new maps, overlaying older claims. In this way, memory became defense. Temples could not always raise armies, but they could unroll a scroll, place it on the floor before a visiting official, and say, "Look, here is the proof. We remember, do you?" The invisible web of records. By the 11th century, Japan was covered in a paper web. Monasteries with multiple archives, private estates with field registers, district offices with overlapping tax records, central ministries struggling to reconcile diverging versions. No single archive had the whole truth, but the act of remembering through writing had become universal. Even households kept family documents. Even merchants used court-style formats. The shape of bureaucracy had passed into habit. This was the true legacy of the Ritzerio scribal system, not centralized control, but distributed memory. The scroll as mirror. In the end, each scroll was more than a container of facts. It was a mirror reflecting not only what happened, but who cared to remember. A copied petition was a political act. A well-kept register was a statement of dignity. A dusty rice tax scroll in a lacquered chest was a quiet testament to persistence. The monk who copied it, the scribe who preserved it, and the reader who trusted it each participated in a ritual of continuity. And though the empires of men rise and fall, the paper they leave behind outlasts them not because it is strong, but because someone, somewhere, took the time to copy it again. Is it the content of a scroll that matters, or the decision to preserve it, to carry it forward, to let it live one more generation? When even silence is written down, can bureaucracy become a kind of memory without end? Beyond the scribes, beyond the temple clerks and the court officials, there is one more place where the archive reaches its most ambitious and most sacred form. It sits quietly behind the great Buddha Hall at Tadaji Temple in Nara, elevated above the ground on sturdy stilts of cypress wood. Its beams are thick, its windows are small, its roof is steep and solemn, draped with clay tiles. At first glance, it looks like a simple granary. But this is no ordinary building. This is the Shasin, the imperial treasure house of the 8th century, and within its walls, a version of the world was preserved. Here, the mundane and the magnificent were stored side by side. Brushes and boxes, bolts of cloth, Buddhist sutras, perfumes from Persia, Chinese instruments, ivory dice, dance masks, glass from Rome. And scrolls. Scrolls detailing what each item was, who donated it, when, where it came from, what its purpose had been, and what its value was deemed to be in the eyes of heaven and the state. In this final section of Story 4, we enter the Shasin, not only as a structure, but as a symbol, a monument to the power of bureaucratic memory, and to the strange beauty of archiving as a philosophy of history itself. A treasure house unlike any other. The Shasin was originally constructed to house offerings made by Empress Kamio following the death of her husband, Emperor Shamu, in 756. She dedicated over 600 personal items to the great Buddha of Tadaji, including robes the emperor had worn, swords he had carried, scrolls he had studied, ritual implements, paintings, foreign curiosities, official edicts and records tied to his reign. What transformed this donation into a lasting historical archive was not merely its content, but its method of preservation. The Shasin was built with airtight sealing techniques, using alternating horizontal logs that shrank with moisture, tightening the walls, raised flooring to deter insects and regulate airflow, layered storage boxes, each tied with cords and sealed with official wax stamps. A structure that, despite Japan's damp climate, managed to preserve materials for over 1,200 years, the oldest surviving wooden building archive of its kind. More than storage, it was a declaration. This will be remembered. The inventory of memory. The Shasin was not only a treasure chest, it was a document in architectural form. Every object had a corresponding scroll. Every scroll had a description of the object, sometimes drawn illustrations. The material composition including quantity, quality, and origin. The donor's name, title, and the circumstances of donation. A record of ritual usage, if applicable. Seal verifications from reviewing officials. In some cases, scrolls would even list who had unwrapped the item during inspections along with time, date, and condition reports. And unlike many archives, the Shasan scrolls and items were never discarded. The act of inspection itself became a ritual of continuity. Each new clerk, monk, or imperial inspector added their name like rings in a tree. Thus the scrolls did not freeze time, they layered it. Bureaucracy as sacred task. What makes the Shasan unique in world history is how it elevates the act of inventory itself to something spiritual. The people who maintained it were not archivists in the modern sense. They were more like guardians of memory selected for purity of character, trained in specific handling techniques, and often sworn to secrecy. Scroll copying in the Shasan followed strict formalities. Special ink was prepared with incense and purifying water. Paper was checked against samples to ensure color and grain uniformity. Margins were measured with thread and weight, not rulers. Names of deities or emperors were written with different brushes to maintain reverence. Even dusting the scrolls required ritual cloths, passed down through generations. Here, bureaucracy became sacred ritual. The act of filing was as holy as the sutra it accompanied. The scroll was not just information, it was testimony. A record of the world. What makes the Shasan truly astonishing is its global scope. Among its preserved objects are Persian glass, Tang Dynasty musical scores, Roman-influenced metalwork, Indian spices, Korean lacquer boxes, Central Asian saddle cloths. Each one comes with a Japanese scroll documenting how it entered the archive. Through these records, we witness an 8th century court trying to capture the entire world, not to dominate it, but to know it, remember it, preserve it. It was, in essence, an archive of experience, a slow, meticulous gathering of things the court had seen, touched, received, and wanted to carry forward. In this way, the Shasan becomes something more than national memory. It becomes civilizational memory. The quiet continuity. The Shasan was closed and sealed repeatedly through the centuries. Periodically, it was reopened for inspection, copying, repair, and then sealed again. It survived. The fall of the Nara capital. The decline of the Heian court. The rise and fall of shogunates. Civil wars, fires, and reforms. Even the modern Meiji Restoration. Through all this, no item was removed. No scroll was deliberately discarded. And so, in the modern era, when historians began cataloging its contents anew, they found over 10,000 items, hundreds of scrolls, unbroken chains of custody, written by hand, tied in string. This is unprecedented. The Shasan is not just a surviving building. It is the oldest complete archival system of its kind, not buried or broken, but simply waiting. Why it matters. Why does any of this matter? Dusty scrolls, old inventories, boxes of robes. Because in the quiet logic of preservation, we find a different kind of history. Most histories follow action wars, laws, revolutions, but this history follows attention. It asks, what did people choose to preserve? What did they record carefully, and what did they neglect? Who did the copying, and why did they keep going? How did memory become material? The Shasan does not shout answers, it whispers possibilities, a treasury not of wealth but of deliberate care. The scroll and the soul. In the final analysis, perhaps the act of archiving, whether by court scribes, monastic clerks, or imperial custodians, is not simply about governance. Perhaps it is a way of saying, this mattered. To copy a scroll is to affirm that what it contains has value not because it will change the world, but because someone lived it. It is a soft resistance against forgetfulness. And in that resistance, bureaucracy becomes something more than dull repetition. It becomes a kind of devotion, one practiced not with prayer, but with brush, thread, and memory. A clerk in the Shasan opens a lacquer box. Inside, he finds a scroll from 756. He unrolls it gently. The paper crackles faintly. He reads the name of a court lady long dead, sees the description of a robe woven in foreign silk, and notes that the inspection record ends with the year 1225. He takes a clean sheet. He prepares new ink. And he begins to write again the same text, the same lines, the same care to ensure that it survives for another 400 years. He is not remembered, but the scroll is. If an empire is remembered more for what it recorded than what it ruled, is that not a kind of immortality? And if the world is fragile, might the quiet act of copying it be the most powerful gesture of all? Story 5. The hidden taxman land surveys, peasant registers, and the making of a state Japan. There is a man standing in a rice field. He is not a farmer. His hands are clean. His robe is light gray, belted high. A scroll is tied to his back, and a thin bamboo rod rests in his hand. He is measuring. From the edge of the field he paces slowly, eyes fixed on the furrow lines. He presses the rod into the soil. He notes the distance with black ink on mulberry paper. He makes no sound, but his presence commands attention. To the farmer watching from the ridge, this man is not a threat. He is not a warrior or a thief or a magistrate. And yet, in a few hours, his brush will decide how much grain must be surrendered, how many sheaves must be bound, how many sacks must be sent east, and how many must remain. This is a tax surveyor. In this story, we follow the mostly invisible yet transformative bureaucracy of land measurement in classical Japan from its origins in the 8th century to its quiet revolution in the 10th. We explore how men with scrolls and bamboo rods, walking silent through fields, helped create the estate system, shun, that would dominate Japan's economy and politics for centuries. Not with swords, not with temples, but with boundaries. The origins of measurement. In the 700s, under the Ritsurio legal system, land was not owned in the modern sense. All fields theoretically belonged to the emperor, who redistributed land to farmers, kyubunden, every 6 years in return for taxes in the form of rice, the so tax, cloth or labor, the yo tax, and local specialties, the cho tax. To calculate what a person owed, the government needed precise data. Who was farming the land? How big were the fields? What type of terrain or irrigation supported the crop? Was the land recently reclaimed or newly cleared? Thus began the official land surveys. Teams of low-ranking clerks, many from modest backgrounds, were dispatched from the central and provincial governments to measure agricultural land. They recorded data in large scrolls called denbucho, field registries, pairing it with household information from koski, population registries. Each plot was defined in units of tan and cho, measured using packing the shaku or foot, measuring rods, often standardized by the Ministry of Popular Affairs, land boundaries, marked by natural features, trees, rocks, ridges, or man-made ditches. In theory, these surveys were neutral and systematic. In practice, they were deeply political. Land is power. Each measurement affected how much rice a family could keep, whether a field was considered taxable, whether temples or nobles could claim immunity, whether the province's governor could meet his tax quota. Even the slope of the field, its susceptibility to flooding, was annotated. Sometimes, farmers tried to trick surveyors by shifting markers or planting temporary boundary hedges. Surveyors, for their part, relied on local informants or trusted the word of prominent households. But ultimately, what mattered was what the scroll said. Once measured and recorded, the field's status was fixed at least until the next review. This turned scrolls into a substitute for the landscape itself. The rise of the shun. By the late 700s, another trend emerged: tax exemptions. Temples, noble families, and high-ranking officials began receiving imperial charters that exempted certain lands from taxation. These lands became known as shun, estates that operated outside of normal provincial authority. At first, shun were rare, but over the next century, their number exploded, and with them, a need for private land surveys. Estate managers, known as shoji or jido, began hearing their own taxmen. These agents copied the bureaucratic style of the state, but with a twist. Their records often claimed newly reclaimed fields that the state hadn't measured, reinterpreted boundaries to favor estate holders, carried seals from temple authorities or court nobles instead of provincial governors. The effect was profound. A peasant could live on land still technically imperial, but find himself answering to an estate clerk holding a scroll that looked very official. And in many cases, the scroll won. The art of the boundary. Unlike modern land titles, early Japanese boundaries were rarely straight lines. They followed ancient trees, burial mounds, river bends, the rock shaped like a turtle. Thus, land surveys required local memory. A skilled taxman had to interview elders, confirm field usage across seasons, note the presence of shrines, irrigation canals, and border markers, shikibo. Disputes were frequent, fields changed shape, rivers shifted, farmers encroached. In these moments, the taxman's scroll became a tool of judgment. He would present it to both parties, point to the entries, read aloud the listed dimensions, and then remeasure the field. Even if both sides disagreed, the written record prevailed. What made a field belong to someone wasn't just the work done upon it. It was what the survey said. Survival through compliance. For common farmers, the emergence of this dual system, imperial tax and estate exemption, meant adapting to multiple layers of authority. Some strategies included voluntarily affiliating with a temple estate, offering part of their harvest in return for tax exemption, joining a noble household's land, allowing their name to be added to a different registry, working as temporary tenants, keeping part of their yield while the landholder claimed the tax exemption. In each case, what mattered most was being recorded on the right scroll. A man could change his legal identity, his address, or even his declared family affiliation if it allowed him to appear under a different estate's protection. In this way, bureaucracy became not just oppressive, but a tool of survival. From scrolls to systems. By the 10th century, Japan's tax system was increasingly fragmented. Central authorities still issued edicts and land laws. Provinces maintained their own registries. Temples and aristocrats held competing scrolls with overlapping claims. Local taxmen, often hired by the estates themselves, acted as both surveyors and enforcers. Some villages had 3 or more surveys, one from the government, one from a temple, one from a noble family. To navigate this, families created household archives, storing copies of older surveys, petitions, and rulings. The peasant became a legal strategist, sometimes commissioning his own scribe to copy a favorable ruling or boundary map. Thus, a simple rice field became the site of competing histories, each preserved on scrolls, each bearing a claim to truth. A revolution without blood. In the end, this transformation from imperial control to estate autonomy happened not through civil war, but through scroll work. Thousands of anonymous taxmen, walking fields with bamboo rods and ink, redrew the fabric of the state. Each new scroll chipped away at centralized authority. Each exemption filed was a small declaration of independence. And yet it all looked orderly. The forms were correct. The handwriting followed protocol. The seals were official. The bureaucracy did not collapse, it migrated. Into temples, into noble houses, into estate offices behind closed doors. The paper empire still ruled, but no longer from the palace. In the field again. And so we return to the rice field, where a surveyor bends to press his rod into the soil. His eyes scan the ridgeline. He makes a mark. The farmer nearby does not protest. He bows slightly and waits. Because both of them know, once the scroll is written, it will outlive them both. It will be copied, carried, filed in a shelf somewhere, tied in cord, labeled with ink, and consulted generations later to decide a dispute between strangers. Not because it is perfect, but because it is recorded. Can a tax ledger become a revolution, not by erasing the past, but by recording it differently? When truth is measured in rods and lines, who decides which memory is correct and who must yield? It is autumn. A clerk sits beneath a paper window. Light filters through in a soft gold. He is copying a land charter not for the emperor, not for a provincial governor, but for a private estate. His brush moves slowly, carefully. The names must match exactly. The distances between characters must be even. The ink must not blot or smear. He recites the lines under his breath as he copies them. He is preserving not just the record, but its authority. The estate is small, a collection of hamlets on the edge of a larger domain, but its power rests in scrolls like this. Charters, surveys, tax registers, hand-copied maps. And this clerk, anonymous though he is part of something larger. The quiet construction of a parallel empire, not one of force, but of paper. This section explores how estate bureaucracy mirrored, co-opted, and ultimately supplanted imperial control. How private archives began to rival central ones, and how ordinary people used written records not only to survive, but to resist. The charter and the copy. By the mid-9th century, the Shun system had matured. Temples, aristocratic families, and even retired emperors held large tracts of land exempt from taxation. To ensure their rights were respected, they secured imperial charters, Chinese letter, Menzaijo, which listed the land's boundaries, its exemption from specific taxes, its administration under a particular estate holder. But the original charter was only part of the story. Estate managers created multiple copies, often annotated or updated. Copies for internal reference. Copies to submit to provincial offices. Copies to present in court if disputes arose. Copies to lend to allied estates or subholders. Thus, paper became power and duplication became survival. Estate offices and paper bureaucracy. Each large estate maintained its own office, staffed by a senior administrator, often a monk or noble relative. Tax clerks and copyists. Messengers and legal intermediaries. Inspectors for tenant compliance. Their records included yearly yield reports down to the bundle, tenant rolls, including birth and marriage information, rent contracts specifying labor or crop share, petitions from farmers asking for relief after floods or locusts, boundary inspection logs detailing disputes and remeasurements. These offices mimicked imperial ministries in form, but not in allegiance. They communicated with each other, shared templates, and even trained one another's staff. Over time, estate administration became its own scholarly field, passed down through manuscripts and oral teaching. A man could train as a clerk on one estate and serve another without ever working for the state. The quiet inversion of authority. The imperial government never formally abolished land surveys or tax registries. But over time, it stopped being the only authority on such matters. Estate scrolls were better preserved, more frequently updated, more readily accessible at the local level, less likely to be altered by political reshuffling. When disputes arose, courts often accepted estate scrolls as valid evidence, even over provincial records, especially if they bore the signature of a respected estate administrator. Thus, the tools of statecraft, once symbols of imperial supremacy, now served a privatized system. In many regions, the local estate clerk had more functional power than the emperor's appointee. Farmers and paper strategies. Peasant households, far from being passive, engaged with this paper bureaucracy actively. They maintained copies of their land contracts, collected witness testimonies in writing for land disputes, commissioned private surveyors to produce alternate maps, filed petitions to both estate lords and government offices, hedging allegiances. A clever household might declare loyalty to a temple estate, simultaneously appear on an imperial tax roll, but request reduction due to error, allow a noble's official to measure part of their land in exchange for protection, and secretly keep older scrolls proving prior arrangements, ready to use if power shifted. This paper game was not deception, it was resilience. To survive, peasants learned to read, copy, and present documents effectively. The humble scroll became a shield against hunger, debt, and confiscation. The shadow archives. Many estate offices developed hidden archive storerooms in temple attics, noble villas, or secluded farmhouses where copies of charters, contracts, and surveys were kept. These were not public, they were controlled knowledge. Only trusted stewards or senior clerks were allowed to access them. In disputes, the right scroll could be produced with perfect timing, like a weapon held in reserve. In some cases, disputes between estates lasted generations, with each side preserving boxes of evidence, layered scrolls, copied, recopied, and annotated by descendants of the original scribes. In this way, land memory became paper memory. And paper, unlike speech, did not forget. Women and the scrolls. Though estate administration was male-dominated, some aristocratic women, particularly widows and nuns, became active custodians of estate records. They endowed land to temples and retained partial control, maintained personal copies of land, surveys tied to their dowries, wrote petitions and legal arguments, sometimes in kana, the phonetic script more accessible to women at the time. In temple shrine complexes, nuns and female administrators oversaw women's compounds, managing their own land allotments and maintaining detailed registries. Some even issued parallel contracts for female tenant farmers. Though often omitted from official histories, their archival work contributed to estate preservation and continuity, especially in times of succession crisis or political turmoil. Literacy and its limits. Despite the growth of paper-based power, literacy remained limited. Many peasants relied on professional scribes to draft petitions. Scrolls often included reading guides for less literate clerks, markings, summaries, or color codes. Land surveys were sometimes illustrated with crude maps, not for precision, but for narrative recall. These were maps that said, "The path turns by the willow tree," "The field of the ox who drowned," "Past the stone with Buddha's face." Such records were not cartographic, they were mnemonic. But when presented alongside official seals and imperial charters, they became effective evidence, blending memory, story, and authority. The moral weight of the scroll. In many disputes, it was not just legality but morality that was judged. Had the petitioner copied the scroll respectfully? Were the seals applied correctly? Had the household fulfilled duties in prior years? Did the family scrolls match the spirit of the charter? A peasant with clean, well-preserved scrolls might be seen as righteous. A noble who altered a date carelessly could be accused of arrogance. In a world of fragile legitimacy, Documentary conduct became a proxy for social standing. Resistance in paper form. Some peasants went further. They created forgeries of old surveys to claim tax immunity. They collaborated with rival estates to cross-reference land claims and resist encroachment. They leaked scrolls to government inspectors when powerful estate managers grew too aggressive. These acts were rarely open rebellion. Instead, they were paper resistance, legal, calm, and devastatingly effective. In a land where scrolls were law, he who copied best won. A field rewritten. By the year 1000, much of Japan's arable land was effectively under private control. The imperial court still existed. The ministries still wrote edicts, but in the provinces, power flowed through estate documents, not decrees. A peasant family, farming the same field for 5 generations, might have a chest of rent records, a hand-copied map, a copy of a 9th century exemption, a petition written in kana and signed with thumbprints. And with these documents, they could face down a magistrate not with force, but with paper lineage. What was once imperial land had been rewritten, line by line, until its meaning changed. If a scroll survives long enough, does it become more real than the field it describes? And when memory is measured in ink and thread, how do we know whose story the land is truly telling? A scroll lies sealed in cord, stored in a wooden chest wrapped in cloth. The ink has faded slightly, the paper yellowed by time and smoke. It is a land charter, copied and recopied for generations. Once a Buddhist monk oversaw its transcription. Later, a provincial noble reviewed it. Now, in the early 12th century, it is in the hands of a warrior, not a scribe or a monk, but a mounted landholder wearing lamellar armor and sword. He does not write scrolls, but he relies on them. And in this moment, as a dispute over irrigation rights reaches his estate's border, he calls for the scroll to be read aloud. This is how the samurai rose, not only through force, but by inheriting the paper bureaucracy that came before them. This final section explores how estate administration and paper authority laid the groundwork for Japan's military aristocracy. It reveals how bureaucratic practices shaped the samurai class, and how, even as violence entered the picture, the sword still bowed to the scroll. Inheriting the estate system. By the late Heian period, late 11th to 12th centuries, shun had become the dominant landholding model in Japan. Their administration remained paper-based, but control of those papers and the lands they represented had begun shifting. Enter the samurai. Initially small-time land enforcers and estate guards, samurai gradually assumed more responsibility, collecting rents on behalf of absentee estate owners, settling disputes between tenant families, protecting boundaries from neighboring encroachments, upholding tax exemptions against provincial governors. As their power grew, many warriors assumed de facto control of the lands they once protected. But they did not reject estate scrolls. They absorbed them. Bureaucracy on horseback. These emerging warrior landholders recognized the administrative value of paper. They preserved estate registries for reference, kept tenant rolls updated to track labor and loyalty, required written contracts for tax and land use, consulted old survey maps to defend borders. Though illiteracy was common among low-ranking samurai, they employed scribes and stewards to manage the paperwork. A small warrior compound might have a resident scribe trained in estate protocol, a chest of scrolls containing contracts, inheritance records, and oaths, instructions for messengers to carry petitions to Kyoto, using the correct format and terminology. Thus, the samurai, often imagined as blunt instruments of force, became guardians of record. They governed not just with the sword, but with the scroll. Conflict and the paper trail. As land disputes escalated, so did the need for clear documentation. When two warriors clashed over a valley, they brought competing charters to court. When a tax was levied by a provincial governor, the estate's exemption document served as shield. When tenants revolted, warrior lords produced copies of rent contracts showing terms had been met. Legal violence sanctioned force depended on recorded justification. In this context, land rights could be inherited by birth but validated by documents, contested by producing an older, stronger scroll, awarded via imperial decree or estate grant, purchased with formal contracts and witnesses. Samurai governance, emerging through local rule, was bureaucracy made muscular, backed by arms but anchored in documents. Scrolls and swords, a symbiotic order. In estate compounds, the scribe's desk and the sword rack often stood in the same room. This physical proximity reflected a deeper truth. One validated the other. A tax demand was only legitimate if recorded properly. A land claim was only strong if anchored in a charter. A boundary dispute was only enforceable if the scroll survived. The most powerful warrior households maintained archives rivaling those of temples. They sent their sons to clerical tutors as well as martial instructors. A competent heir was expected to ride a horse, draw a bow, read a survey, quote estate law. To rule land was to read it and its paperwork. The estate manager becomes the ruler. As the imperial court weakened and the Kamakura shogunate rose, from 1185, estate structures were absorbed into a new, decentralized military government. Key features were retained. Tax immunity was preserved under new military laws. Land registers continued to determine authority. Estate managers became official government positions. The Kamakura Bakufu appointed Jido to oversee both civil and military duties, but their power still flowed through scrolls. A Jido's appointment was recorded in duplicate and filed. Tax collections had to be itemized in writing. Confiscated lands were reassigned via writs bearing seals. In many cases, a century-old estate charter was the first document consulted when installing a new samurai administrator. What began as estate paperwork had become the skeleton of military rule. The return of the peasant voice. Amid this transformation, peasants remained engaged. They filed grievances against abusive Jido, presented old estate documents to defend usage rights, organized village councils that preserved communal copies of land surveys. Some even appealed directly to the shogunate in Kamakura, bypassing local authorities, citing documentation that, in some cases, predated their samurai rulers. Peasants may not have controlled swords, but they controlled memory, and in a scroll-based system, memory had legal weight. Even in a warrior age, the paper voice endured. When documents failed, despite its reach, the estate scroll system was vulnerable. Fires destroyed archives. Floods erased land markers. Inheritance disputes led to document forgeries. Military coups rewrote land boundaries, often ignoring past claims. But these crises did not end the bureaucracy. Rather, they triggered a new wave of documentation. Replacement charters, court-ordered surveys, inventories of damaged archives. Each rupture led to more paperwork, a doubling of effort to restore the appearance of continuity. Even when power changed hands by force, legitimacy still had to be written down. The legacy of the taxman. What began with anonymous clerks measuring rice fields in the 700s had, by 1200, become a system of decentralized but highly structured land governance, a fusion of military and administrative roles, a culture where memory, law, and landscape were preserved in scrolls. The samurai class, far from dismissing these boring bureaucratic details, enshrined them. The measure of a lord was not just his battlefield record, but the order of his archives. Peasant families continued to keep their own chests of documents, family land ledgers, temple donations, marriage contracts, and even copies of disputes from past centuries. In this world, to be forgotten was to be erased. To survive was to be recorded. In the archive's silence, return once more to the field. The farmer is gone, the taxman is gone, even the samurai has passed. But the scroll remains, tucked in a quiet storeroom beneath an old temple beam, tied with hemp cord, faint ink, a map of the river bend, names you no longer recognize, a field whose soil still bears the furrows once measured by a bamboo rod. No one reads it now. But for 400 years it shaped who ate, who paid, who fought, who ruled. And that is history, not a roar of banners or battles, but a scroll quietly unrolled on a wooden floor. When rule passes from empire to temple, from temple to estate, from estate to sword, and all the while the scrolls are copied, who, then, truly governs? And if every act of power must be recorded to endure, is it the ink, not the blade, that writes history? Story 6. The messengers burden couriers, scrolls, and the communication web of ancient Japan, 8th–11th century. There is a road that runs eastward through the pines, flanked by quiet villages and rice paddies. It is not paved, it is not grand, it is rutted from rain, scattered with leaves and the occasional hoofprint. But on this road history moves. Not on horseback, not in carriages, but on foot, carried by men whose names you will never read, whose voices you will never hear, but whose presence made the empire function. They are couriers, imperial messengers known as ekishi, Chinese letter, runners of the state. They carry no weapons, only scrolls wrapped in cloth, stamped with imperial seals. And without them there would be no orders, no tax edicts, no census records, no coordinated ritual between court and province. This is the story of Japan's ancient communication network, not as a marvel of logistics, but as a quiet tapestry of mud paths, fragile scrolls, aching legs, and the weight of responsibility borne in silence. The system behind the scroll. In the 8th century, under the Ritsuryo system, Japan established a national courier network modeled on Chinese precedent. It was called the Ekishi, Chinese letter, the station system. At its height, this network stretched from Dasefu in Kyushu all the way to the capital in Nara, later Kyoto. Its components included post stations, Chinese letter, Yumiya, every 16–20 km. Horses and porters supplied by local authorities. Station officials who recorded arrivals, departures, and sealed scrolls. Every official document moving across the country had to pass through this network, but it was not swift nor glamorous. The average courier, a low-ranking scribe or conscripted laborer, would walk 30–40 kilometers per day, resting briefly at way stations before continuing. They carried imperial edicts, Chinese letter, Daijikampu, tax orders, census forms, petitions from distant provinces, reports on famines, rebellions, or floods. Their job was not to interpret, only to deliver. A day in the life of a courier. The courier awakes before dawn. His pack is light food for one day, a waterskin, and a scroll tucked inside an oiled leather case. He has a wooden tablet strung to his side with a seal proof of his role as a messenger. Without it, he risks arrest as a vagrant. He steps onto the road. His journey may last 3 days or 10, depending on the distance. Some are local couriers, operating within one province. Others, drawn from the Ministry of Popular Affairs, are dispatched from the capital. They eat simple fare, Rice balls wrapped in bamboo, pickled vegetables, dried fish if lucky. They sleep on tatami mats in station huts, or in barns when stations are full. Sometimes they are greeted warmly. Other times they are ignored. But they press on because delays in communication meant delays in governance. And in some cases, delays meant death. Feet as infrastructure. There were no telegraphs, no horses speeding through the night with urgent dispatches. While some couriers rode mounts, many walked the entire distance. Thus, the empire's ability to function depended on the condition of the roads, the weather, the health of the courier's legs. Flooded bridges meant lost days, mudslides meant rerouting, snow meant messages buried before delivery. To prevent collapse, station masters kept detailed logs of courier movements. These logs included name and origin, scroll origin and type, time of arrival, time of departure, any accidents or delays. In this way, each journey became part of a living archive, a paper trail of motion. But few read these records. They were not about glory. They were about continuity. The social position of the courier. Couriers were not elite, most were. Conscripts drawn from peasant populations. Minor clerks trained in reading but not governance. Occasionally, monks or temple servants, especially when carrying ritual documents. Despite their low status, they occupied a strange position of trust. They were expected to not open the scrolls. They had to remember routes and timing precisely. They served as the bridge between distant power and local response. A courier might carry an edict from the emperor to a regional governor and never speak a word to either. He was a vessel, not a voice. But without his movement, the system failed. Accidents and disappearances. Not every scroll arrived. Bandits sometimes targeted couriers. Illness claimed many on the road. Swollen rivers swept away both men and paper. When a courier failed to arrive, multiple investigations were triggered. The station where he last checked in was fined. The province of his origin was questioned. The message was recopied and resent, but delays might already have caused damage. In one record, a tax relief order was delayed by a week due to a courier's death en route. By the time the message arrived, a village had already fled, fearing punishment for non-payment. In such cases, the failure of a single courier could reshape lives. Messages of crisis. Most scrolls were routine. Harvest totals, population updates, confirmations of ceremonies. But some were urgent. Reports of revolt, scrawled hastily in kana. News of epidemics, requesting medicine or isolation orders. Requests for troop dispatch, sealed with red ink and wax. For these, special messengers called toshi, Chinese letter, were used faster, armed, and often escorted. Still, even these messages took days to arrive. And so every scroll, even the mundane, carried the possibility of transformation. A land allotment order might resettle a family. A ritual date might change temple proceedings. A tax directive might crush a village or spare it. All in ink, carried in silence on muddy feet. Training and tools. There were no courier academies. Training was practical. Learn the routes. Memorize station names. Protect the scroll. Speak little, travel fast, arrive intact. Some stations issued route maps, crude by modern standards but clear enough to follow. Couriers also memorized landmarks. The fork where a pine grows sideways. The shrine with the red banners. The field of yellow irises that marked halfway. In fog or storm, memory mattered more than visibility. The courier's most important tool, however, was discipline. The scroll must not be wet, the scroll must not tear, the seal must not break. For some, this became a point of pride. To be a courier was to be invisible but exact. The road remembered. When the road quieted in war, famine, or collapsed, the empire's voice went mute. Couriers, humble as they were, kept continuity alive. They passed each other in silence, nodded at station gates, slept beside the hearths of farmers who barely looked up. Their names were not recorded with honor, but every edict, every census, every petition in the imperial archive once traveled on their backs. You do not see them in paintings. You rarely find them in poetry. But they were there in the background, carrying scrolls that wrote the shape of governance. If the scroll arrives but no one opens it, does its power still live? And if the man carrying the emperor's words dies in the forest, did the order ever exist at all? The station hut is empty. The hearth has gone cold. The records cabinet is open, its scrolls mildewed, its seals cracked from time and damp. Grass creeps through the corners of the floorboards. Outside, a dirt road winds through mist, once busy with footfall, now silent. It is the year 1035. The official Eisai system, the once grand national courier network of Imperial Japan, is in decay. The roads remain, the way stations remain, but the central pulse that sustained them has faded. Yet messages still move. Not through empire, but through local lords, temples, and estates. A new class of messenger has emerged, one that walks not only for authority, but for necessity. These men and women form the arteries of Japan's fragmented communication web, no longer centralized but functional in patchwork. This section traces how the loss of imperial control over infrastructure gave rise to private communication networks, from temple couriers to estate messengers to hired scribes, all still walking, still carrying scrolls, still making history move. Collapse in slow motion. The Eisai system did not end with a decree. It deteriorated slowly. Several factors contributed. Privatization of land shun meant local lords no longer relied on state messages. Budget cuts at the capital reduced funding for station upkeep. Decline in road maintenance made long-distance travel treacherous. Officials appointed to distant provinces brought their own messengers instead of relying on state couriers. By the early 11th century, many post stations had become privately managed, run by temples or wealthy families, converted into storage sheds, granaries, or even shrines. Abandoned, surviving only as names on maps. The couriers who once wore state seals now bore estate badges, temple tokens, or nothing at all. The rise of the private messenger. As the Eisai system faded, a new class of messengers emerged, tied to temple networks, such as those run by the powerful Inryakujai or Kafukujai. Aristocratic households who managed estates from the capital. Merchant families expanding early commercial routes. Regional governors and military families developing personal courier squads. These private messengers were known by many names. Tsukai, Chinese letter, Japanese letter, general messenger. Atoko, Chinese letter, or Anna, Chinese letter, male or female retainers performing delivery duties. Hikyaku, Chinese letter, a term that later gained prominence in the Edo period, but began to appear earlier. They often wore no formal uniform, carried scrolls wrapped in plain cloth, and traveled without legal protection, relying instead on personal reputation, local alliances, or temple affiliation. The temple postal web. Among the most organized non-government networks were those of Buddhist temples. Temples such as Tadaja in Nara, Koyasan in Wakayama, Mount Hiei near Kyo, developed extensive courier systems to manage their landholdings across multiple provinces. Religious correspondence, tax and rent collection, monastic transfers and pilgrimage support. These couriers were often monks or temple servants, dressed plainly, with small metal amulets or paper certificates proving their temple affiliation. They followed known routes, often sleeping at affiliate temples or lay supporters' homes. Some left written messages etched onto stones along the path, primitive signposts for fellow couriers. They also carried letters of gratitude, ritual schedules, and requests for sutra transcriptions. To serve as a temple courier was not just labor, it was merit-making, a sacred task in a sacred network. Messenger strategies, navigating a fragmented land. Without centralized protection, messengers had to learn to navigate multiple jurisdictions with different tolls, passes, and local customs. Bandit territory, where messengers could be robbed or ransomed. Estate boundaries, where rival lords could demand bribes or impede travel. To survive, messengers relied on route knowledge, including secret paths, river crossings, and shrine shelters. Verbal codes shared among networks to verify identity. Scroll concealment, hiding sensitive messages inside walking staffs or clothing folds. Recitation training, memorizing the contents of messages in case scrolls were lost. They also formed informal alliances. Couriers shared tips at rest stops. Some bartered information about conditions ahead. Others helped fellow messengers evade arrest by dressing as pilgrims. Through these networks, a culture of discreet solidarity developed, one forged not in law, but in mutual understanding. The estate as a communication hub. By the late 11th century, major estates functioned almost like small states, complete with their own clerical staff, courier systems, scroll archives, legal scribes. Estate managers issued their own delivery instructions, complete with messenger routes, confirmation procedures upon delivery, payment logs for services rendered, penalties for delay or mishandling. In effect, the estate office replaced the imperial station. Some wealthier estates maintained relay systems, with couriers stationed at intervals to hand off scrolls echoing the original Eikaisai model, but now fully privatized. In some cases, competing estates employed spies posing as messengers, sent to intercept rival communications. Scroll delivery had become an instrument of local politics. Women in the messenger web. Though male couriers predominated, women also played roles in this evolving system. They served particularly in temple complexes with female convents, estate households, delivering messages between matriarchs or widows managing land, market towns, carrying merchant correspondence between families. Because they were less likely to be suspected of espionage or theft, some female messengers carried more sensitive documents, including inheritance documents, marriage contracts, records of noble debts. These women sometimes adopted pilgrim attire or disguised themselves as domestic servants, allowing them to move across checkpoints with less scrutiny. Their scrolls were small, folded, and tucked into sleeves or hair wraps. Their movement was quiet but essential. Petitions and the power of paper. Beyond official scrolls, the roads also carried petitions often written by peasants, monks, or displaced individuals. These were addressed to temples, noble patrons, or the shogunate, carried by messengers for small fees, sometimes copied multiple times to increase survival odds. A well-written petition could win tax relief, restore lost land rights, prevent punishment for alleged crimes, but only if it arrived. Thus, even the poorest petitioners depended on messengers entrusting their fates to mud-covered sandals and calloused hands. In this way, messengers became vectors of hope as much as administration. New roads, new realities. Despite fragmentation, Japan's communication networks remained active and adaptive. Temples maintained consistency through religious routes. Estates formed overlapping webs of delivery corridors. Merchant routes along rivers and coasts began to influence courier paths. Local rulers adopted the old imperial form stamps, seals, even route logs, giving continuity to the aesthetics of legitimacy. By the time the samurai-dominated Kamakura period emerged, late 12th century, the template for private communication systems was already in place. The scroll still moved. The road still mattered. But the flag it flew beneath had changed. If the path from Kyoto to Dasefu is broken, but the scroll still reaches its reader, where then does the empire live? And when 1,000 messengers walk 1,000 roads, each for a different master, do they carry division or the threads of a hidden unity? The boots are better now, thicker soles, lined with hemp and wool. The scroll cases are heavier lacquered wood, iron-bound, some with locking seals. The roads are still uneven, but patrols now march them regularly. It is 1234, and a new order governs Japan. The Kamakura shogunate, born in the ashes of the Genpei War, has restructured power, not entirely replacing the emperor, but creating a parallel state rooted in warrior values, martial law, and regional control. Yet amid the swords and banners, one thing remains unchanged. Messages still move. The empire's memory still travels in scrolls borne now by messengers of the shogun as well as priests, nobles, and villagers. The courier, once an anonymous footnote in imperial bureaucracy, has become an essential figure in Japan's new reality. This final section explores how the messenger quiet, often unseen, became the nervous system of a warrior bureaucratic state, and how the slow evolution of Japan's communication systems reveals a truth easily forgotten. The sword may conquer, but it is the scroll that sustains. The Kamakura bureaucracy, war, law, and logistics. Following the Minamoto victory in 1185 and the official establishment of the Kamakura shogunate in 1192, the nature of governance shifted. The capital remained in Kyoto spiritually and ceremonially, but political control now flowed from Kamakura, over 450 kilometers to the east. This dual system required 2 capitals, 2 sets of records, 2 chains of command, and critically, it required new communication arteries. Unlike the earlier imperial system, which relied on ritual continuity and symbolic presence, the Kamakura regime required rapid dispatch of legal rulings, especially land disputes, regular reporting from Jido stewards and Shugo military governors, confirmation of vassal loyalty, especially after rebellions. This necessity led to the formalization of courier routes, including the Kamakura Kaido, a network of roads connecting Kamakura to Kyoto, Nara, and regional strongholds. Specialized shogunal messengers called hikyaku, who were often armed, mounted, appointed by the Mandikaro administrative board or Samurai Dakaro military board. These messengers represented not only speed but command. Their arrival carried weight. Their documents bore the shogunate's red seal shuinjo, recognizable and feared. The new role of the courier: speed, authority, and risk. Kamakura-era messengers differed in several key ways from their imperial predecessors. Higher status, trusted retainers or warriors, not peasants. Greater speed, horse relays when possible, and express designation for urgent matters. Wider range of duties, delivering summons to lords, carrying detailed land survey results, transporting legal documents or executions orders. But they still carried water flasks, food parcels, paper-wrapped scrolls protected from rain by oiled silk or bamboo tubes. They still depended on Road conditions, station reliability, personal discipline. Despite improvements, dangers remained. Banditry still plagued rural roads. Some messengers disappeared. Others were deliberately intercepted by rival clans during succession disputes or local wars. To counter this, certain messengers traveled in pairs or as small armed groups. A few left behind written logs of their journey's rough travel diaries, with notes like, "Fourth day, Riverside in burned, proceeded on foot through forest, scroll intact, left market Pine Shrine." These records, now tucked into temple libraries or estate archives, show the blend of routine and risk, duty and improvisation, that defined their profession. The scrolls they carried, orders, surveys, and silent power. The Kamakura shogunate relied heavily on documentation. Some common scroll types included Chijiyamandai, land ownership confirmation papers; Sojo legal appeals; Fumin summons or mandates from the shogunate; Mokuroku listings of confiscated or reallocated property; Gunki Monogatari narratives of battles, often transcribed from oral reports. These documents were not only legal instruments, they were assertions of narrative control. To carry such a scroll was to bear proof of a version of truth, one that would be copied, cited, and used to redraw maps, appoint stewards, or punish traitors. A single misdelivered scroll could result in entire villages changing hands. A delayed report might mean an uprising goes unpunished or worsens. Thus, messengers became silent arbiters of historical outcomes. From scroll to sword, messengers in war. During military campaigns, the role of the messenger expanded. In the Jakyu War, 1221, when the retired Emperor Go-Toba attempted to overthrow the Kamakura shogunate, victory hinged on fast intelligence, troop movement coordination, shifting loyalties. Messengers moved across the archipelago with mobilization orders, defection reports, letters of assurance or threat. Some rode horses with flags marking them as safe passage, envoys. Others went in disguise, blending with monks or merchants. Those captured were often tortured for information, then executed. In war, the messenger became a weapon and a risk. Yet despite the danger, their work continued because the shogunate understood something vital. Victory was not just about battles won. It was about messages arriving in time. The legacy of the scroll carrier. By the end of the Kamakura period, 1333, Japan's courier culture had been permanently reshaped. Some enduring features included semi-formal relay systems, later evolving into early postal services; codified messenger ranks with pay scales and protocols; the use of ink seals, standardized format scrolls, and storage registers; the continued use of temple and estate messengers, now working parallel to military ones. Even as the Ashikaga shogunate replaced the Kamakura regime, the reliance on paper movement by human hands remained. In peaceful years, messengers became record keepers as well as couriers, sometimes remaining in towns to help manage archives, tax rolls, or ritual calendars. In violent years, they returned to the road, slipping past checkpoints, crossing burned bridges, carrying orders that reshaped lives. The slow evolution of messaging from imperial edict to military warrant, from peasant courier to armored rider, tells a story not only of administration, but of human resilience in the face of distance, disorder, and danger. Reflections: the unseen path. You may never read the name of the man who carried the scroll that transferred your ancestors' land. You will not find a statue honoring the woman who delivered the appeal that spared a village from punishment. Their journeys were not recorded in grand chronicles, but they were there, in the sleet, in the fog, on paths between rice paddies and shrine gates, carrying scrolls that spoke with the voice of rulers, gods, generals, and monks, even though the messengers themselves remained voiceless. Their boots wore out, their scrolls dried in the sun, their names were forgotten. But their work shaped everything. And long after the stations crumbled, the palanquins rotted, and the banners fell, the scrolls they carried still sleep in the archives, stamped with ink, curled with age, but waiting, always waiting to be read. Does the messenger disappear when the message is delivered? Or does every page still carry the echo of footsteps long faded from the road?